The photograph sat in a cardboard box, edges worn from 2 decades of handling. Master Sergeant William Keller stared out from frozen time, 19 years old in his army dress greens, standing rigid before an American flag in some long-forgotten studio in Saigon. The year was 1967. He would be dead within 8 months, his body shipped home in a flag-draped coffin to a 2-year-old daughter who would never remember his face except through this single image. Captain Grace Keller held the photograph now, 40 years after her father's death, in an office at Fort Bragg that she had occupied for the past 6 years. December cold seeped through the window behind her desk. Outside, pine trees bent under Carolina wind. Inside, her hands moved methodically through boxes, sorting 22 years of military service into categories: keep, discard, donate. The photograph of her father went into the keep pile. It always did. Her office looked skeletal now. Commendations had been removed from walls, leaving pale rectangles on paint faded by sunlight. Her rifle, a Barrett M82 that had belonged to her mentor, Colonel James Hartley, stood in its case by the door ready for transport. The weapon had been with her through Iraq, through Afghanistan, through missions she could never discuss with anyone outside classified briefings. 37 confirmed kills at ranges exceeding 2 kilometers. They called her Ghost because targets dropped without ever seeing the muzzle flash, without ever knowing death had found them through a scope. But Ghost was retiring. She was 42 years old. Her body carried the accumulated damage of 2 decades in combat zones, 3 bullet scars, shrapnel fragments embedded too deep for safe removal, knees that ached before rain, a shoulder that had been dislocated twice and never quite healed right. Her face showed the weather of war, lines carved by desert sun and mountain cold, but her eyes remained sharp, pale blue like winter sky, capable of tracking movement at distances that made other soldiers shake their heads in disbelief. Grace lifted another item from the box, a medal, the Bronze Star, awarded for valor in Fallujah when she was 26. She remembered the firefight with perfect clarity, the way dust had tasted in her mouth, the weight of her rifle, the moment she had dropped an insurgent at 800 meters who was about to launch an RPG into a building where Marines were pinned down. She had saved lives that day. The medal felt light in her hand, insubstantial, as if it could not possibly represent what it was supposed to commemorate. The knock on her door was soft but firm. "Come in," she said without turning. The door opened. She heard boots on linoleum, the distinctive cadence of a soldier who had been walking military corridors for longer than most recruits had been alive. "Ma'am." Sergeant First Class James Martinez stood in the doorway, medical packs slung over one shoulder, communication equipment over the other. He was 45 years old, stocky and solid, with hands that could set a broken bone as easily as they could strip and reassemble a radio. His father had served in Vietnam, came home with nightmares that never fully left him. Doc Martinez, as everyone called him, had grown up understanding that some wounds never showed up in medical charts. "Doc," Grace turned, offered a slight smile. "Come to make sure I'm actually leaving?" Martinez stepped inside, closed the door behind him. His eyes swept the empty office, the boxes, the bare walls. "Word is you're really doing it this time. No last-minute extensions, no one more tour." "This is it." Grace gestured at the boxes. 22 years, 3 wars. Time to go home. Martinez nodded slowly. He had heard soldiers say similar things before. Most of them never made it home, at least not the part of them that mattered. Katie must be excited. At the mention of her daughter, Grace's expression softened. 14 years old now. Hasn't had a full Christmas with me since she was 8. This year I promised her. Home for good. No more deployments. "You sure about that?" Martinez's tone was gentle but skeptical. "Because I've known you a long time, ma'am. Soldiering isn't something you do. It's something you are." Grace met his eyes. "Maybe, but Katie deserves a mother who's actually present, not just someone who calls from halfway around the world and sends birthday cards 3 weeks late because mail doesn't run regular from combat zones." Martinez understood. He had a son, 16 years old, who barely knew him. The boy had been raised mostly by his ex-wife, while Martinez stitched wounds and called in medevacs from places whose names were classified. It was the price of service, the cost that never appeared on recruiting posters. "So this is really it," he said quietly. The Ghost hangs up her rifle. Grace looked at the Barrett in its case. The rifle had belonged to Colonel Hartley, her mentor, The man who had taught her that sniping was not about killing, but about patience, about discipline, about knowing when not to pull the trigger. Hartley had died in Afghanistan in 2011, stepped on a pressure plate IED while trying to save a convoy. Grace had held him as he died, had promised him she would finish the mission, whatever it took. She had kept that promise. She had kept it for 13 years. "The rifle stays in service," Grace said. "I'm donating it to the regiment museum. Let the next generation see what a real sniper's weapon looks like." Martinez smiled slightly. "They'll put a plaque on it. Captain Grace Keller, the Ghost, 37 confirmed kills, Distinguished Service Cross." Grace shook her head. "I don't want my name on it. Put Hartley's. He was the real sniper. I was just his student." Before Martinez could respond, the phone on Grace's desk rang. Not her cell phone, which sat silent in her pocket, but the hard line, the secure phone that only rang when someone with serious rank needed to reach her immediately. Grace and Martinez exchanged glances. She picked up the receiver. "Captain Keller." The voice on the other end was gravelly, weathered by decades of command. "Captain, this is General Carmichael. I need you in the briefing room. 15 minutes. Sir, with respect, I am processing out. My retirement paperwork is already submitted." There was a pause. Then Carmichael said, "I know, but I have a situation. And I need the best. That's you." 15 minutes, Captain. That's an order." The line went dead. Grace stood holding the receiver, feeling the weight of what had just happened. Martinez watched her face. "Let me guess," he said. "One more mission." Grace set the phone down carefully. She looked at the boxes, at the photograph of her father, at the rifle that had belonged to Hartley. She thought about Katie, about the promise she had made to be home for Christmas, about the retirement she had earned after more than 2 decades of service. Then she thought about Hartley's words, spoken as he died with his blood soaking into Afghan dirt. "Promise me you'll finish the mission, whatever it takes." 15 minutes, Grace said to Martinez. "Briefing room. Looks like the Ghost has one more job." Martinez nodded, unsurprised. He had known her too long to expect anything different. "Want me to come?" "If it's what I think it is," Grace said, picking up her rifle case. "You're already on the roster." They walked through corridors Grace had walked 1,000 times before. Fort Bragg was more than a military installation to her. It was the place where she had transformed from a grieving daughter trying to understand her father's sacrifice into a soldier who carried on his legacy. She had arrived here at 20, fresh from basic training, angry at a world that had taken her father before she could know him. She was leaving at 42, still trying to understand what his death had meant, still trying to determine if the cost had been worth paying. The briefing room was on the second floor of the command building. Grace pushed through the door and found herself facing a situation she had seen dozens of times before. Maps spread across tables, satellite imagery pinned to walls, officers standing in small clusters, speaking in low voices. The familiar electric tension of a mission being planned filled the room like static before a storm. General Thomas Carmichael stood at the head of the table. He was 62 years old, gray-haired and iron-backed, a soldier who had come up through enlisted ranks during the tail end of Vietnam and had never lost the hard edge that combat carved into men. He looked up as Grace entered, and something in his expression made her realize this was not a routine operation. "Captain Keller." Carmichael's voice carried parade ground authority. "Thank you for coming." Grace set her rifle case against the wall and approached the table. Martinez followed, taking up positions slightly behind her left shoulder. She scanned the faces in the room, intelligence officers, operations planners, and standing near the far end of the table, a man she recognized with a sinking feeling in her gut. Major Ryan Blackwood was 38 years old, West Point educated, with a service record that looked impressive on paper but was conspicuously light on actual combat experience. He had the polished appearance of an officer who spent more time in briefing rooms than in the field. Uniform pressed to knife edges, boots mirror-shined, posture textbook perfect. Grace had worked with him before, 6 months ago on a training exercise, and the experience had left her with an instinct she could not quite articulate, a sense that something about Blackwood was off in ways that had nothing to do with his competence and everything to do with his character. Blackwood met her eyes across the table and smiled. It was not a warm smile. "Captain Keller," he said, "I hear congratulations are in order. Retirement after distinguished service." Grace nodded once, not returning the smile. "Thank you, sir." Carmichael cleared his throat, drawing attention back to the mission. Gentlemen, Captain, let's begin. He gestured to a map of the Caucasus Mountains. Operation Shepherd. We have intelligence that a CIA analyst, Dr. Robert Kessler, is being held by hostile forces in this region. He's been missing for 6 weeks. We believe he possesses critical information about a new missile defense system the Russians are developing in these mountains. Grace studied the map. The terrain was brutal. High altitude, steep approaches, limited extraction points. Winter conditions would make it exponentially more dangerous. She had operated in mountains before, had learned to account for thin air and extreme cold, but the Caucasus in December was as hostile an environment as existed on Earth. Why now, she asked. Why Christmas Eve? Carmichael pointed to a notation on the map. Intelligence suggests Kessler is being moved tonight. Our adversaries assume American forces will stand down for the holiday. They're wrong. Grace leaned forward, studying the insertion points, the approaches, the defensive positions. Her mind automatically began calculating angles, wind patterns, sight lines. This was what she had been trained to do, what she had done for 22 years. Even knowing she should walk away, knowing she had promised Katie she would be home, she could not stop her brain from working the problem. Sir, she said carefully, this terrain favors defense. Any approach through the valley will be exposed. If I were planning an ambush, I would position teams exactly where we would need to insert. Carmichael nodded. That's why you're here, Captain. Your assessment matches our concerns. But we need boots on the ground. Kessler has information that could compromise national security if it falls into the wrong hands. Grace understood what he was not saying. This was a mission that could not fail, which meant it needed soldiers who would not fail, which meant it needed her. Who's leading? She asked, though she already suspected the answer. Carmichael gestured to Blackwood. Major Blackwood will command the operation. You'll provide overwatch and tactical guidance. Grace felt Martinez shift behind her, a subtle movement that conveyed disapproval. She kept her own face neutral, but inside she was calculating the risks of operating under Blackwood's command. The man had rank and training, but lacked the combat instinct that kept soldiers alive when plans fell apart. And in her experience, plans always fell apart. Sir, Grace said, choosing her words carefully, with respect, the valley approach is tactically unsound. We should consider coming in from the North Ridge. It's a harder insertion but provides better defensive options if things go wrong. Blackwood's jaw tightened. Captain, I appreciate your input, but I've already planned the approach. We proceed through the valley as briefed. Grace met his eyes and saw something there that made her instincts scream warnings she could not articulate in a room full of superior officers. She had seen that look before, in men who made decisions based on pride rather than sound tactics, men who got soldiers killed because admitting they might be wrong felt like weakness. Sir, she tried again, I've operated in similar terrain. The valley approach is textbook, which makes it predictable. If the enemy has even basic intelligence, they'll be waiting exactly where we're most vulnerable. Major Blackwood's voice went cold. Captain, are you questioning my command decisions? The room went silent. Grace could feel the weight of attention, could sense Carmichael watching to see how she would handle the confrontation. She had spent 22 years learning when to push and when to yield, when to trust her instincts and when to defer to rank. This was a moment that required both wisdom and restraint. No, sir, she said finally. I'm expressing tactical concerns. You're the mission commander. The final decision is yours. Blackwood held her gaze for 3 seconds, asserting dominance, then nodded. Good, we stick to the plan. Insertion at 2200 hours. 6-person team, myself, Captain Keller, Sergeant Martinez, Master Sergeant Briggs, Staff Sergeant Reeves, Specialist Chen, plus flight crew. Weather is going to be challenging. Blizzard conditions, visibility near zero, temperatures minus 30 Celsius. But that works in our favor. The enemy won't expect us to operate in these conditions. Grace said nothing. She was thinking about Katie, about the promise she had made, about the retirement that was slipping away with each passing minute. She was thinking about her father, who had died in a jungle on the other side of the world before she could know him. She was thinking about Hartley, who had made her promise to finish the mission, whatever it took. Captain? Carmichael's voice cut through her thoughts. You're in? Grace looked at the map one more time. She calculated angles and approaches. She measured the distance between what she wanted and what duty demanded. She thought about 3 generations of Kellers who had served, who had sacrificed, who had kept their promises even when those promises cost them everything. "I'm in, sir." Carmichael nodded, satisfied. "Good, you have 6 hours to prep. Wheels up at 2100. Dismissed." The officers began filing out. Grace stayed at the table, studying the map, committing terrain features to memory. Martinez remained at her shoulder. "You should have said no," he murmured. "You've earned the right to walk away." Grace did not look up from the map. "Hartley made me promise. Finish the mission, whatever it takes. I gave my word." "Hartley's been dead 13 years, ma'am. You don't owe him your life." Grace finally turned to face Martinez. "Maybe not, but I owe Katie a mother who keeps her promises. If I walk away now, what kind of example am I setting? That duty only matters when it's convenient. That promises are negotiable." Martinez started to respond, then stopped. He had known Grace long enough to recognize when her mind was made up. "This is your last one," he said finally. "Make it count." They left the briefing room together. Grace checked her watch. 1400 hours. She had 6 hours before insertion, 6 hours to prepare equipment, brief the team, and make a phone call she was dreading. She found a private office and dialed her mother's number. The phone rang twice before Margaret Keller answered. "Grace." Her mother's voice carried the warmth that had sustained Grace through 2 decades of deployments. "Are you calling from the airport?" "Katie's been watching out the window since noon." Grace closed her eyes. "Mom, there's been a situation. I have to take one more mission. I'll be home as soon as I can, but it won't be tonight." The silence on the other end was long and heavy. Grace could hear her mother breathing, could imagine her standing in the kitchen of the house where Grace had grown up. The house where her father's flag sat folded in a display case, where photographs of 3 generations of Kellers in uniform lined the walls. "You promised her," Margaret said quietly. "You looked your daughter in the eyes and promised her you would be home for Christmas." "I know." Grace felt the weight of that broken promise like a physical thing. "But this is important, Mom. Lives are at stake." "Lives are always at stake, Grace." Margaret's voice was gentle but firm. "Your father thought the same thing. He thought one more mission, one more tour, one more sacrifice, and then he was dead and you grew up without him. Is that what you want for Katie?" The words hit Grace like a physical blow. She had spent 40 years trying to understand her father's choices, trying to determine if his sacrifice had been worth the cost. Now she was making the same choice, walking the same path, and she could not explain even to herself why it felt necessary. "This is the last one," Grace said, "I promise. After this, I'm done. No more extensions. No more one more mission. I'm coming home and staying home." "That's what your father said," Margaret replied. "That's what they all say." "Mom, please, I need you to tell Katie something for me. Tell her I'm sorry. Tell her I love her. Tell her this is the last time. Tell her I'm keeping my promise just a few days late." "I'll tell her." Margaret's voice was heavy with resignation. "But Grace, you need to understand something. Katie is 14 years old. She's at the age where she's deciding what kind of person she wants to be, what kind of values matter. Every time you choose duty over her, you're teaching her that promises are negotiable, that she comes second. Is that really the lesson you want her to learn?" Grace had no answer. She sat in silence, holding a phone 3,000 miles away from her daughter, trying to explain choices she could not fully justify even to herself. "I have to go," she said finally. "I'll call when I can. I love you both." She ended the call before her mother could respond. She sat alone in the office, staring at her phone, thinking about Katie watching out a window for a mother who was not coming home. She thought about her father, dead at 23 in a war he probably did not fully understand. She thought about Hartley, bleeding out in Afghan dirt, making her promise to finish the mission. She thought about the rifle waiting in the other room, the Barrett M82 with Hartley's engraving on the stock. Steady hand, clear eye, true heart. Grace stood, squared her shoulders, and walked out of the office. She had made her choice. Right or wrong, she would see it through. The next 4 hours passed in familiar routine. Grace checked her equipment with the methodical precision of 2 decades in combat zones. The Barrett came apart under her hands, each component examined and cleaned, then reassembled with the muscle memory of 1,000 repetitions. The rifle was more than a weapon to her. It was a connection to Hartley, to everything he had taught her about patience and discipline and knowing when not to shoot. Staff Sergeant Anna Reeves found her in the armory. Reeves was 35 years old, a second-generation sniper whom Grace had trained personally over the past 3 years. She had the quiet competence that marked all good snipers, the ability to remain motionless for hours, to control breathing and heartbeat, to make calculations that accounted for wind, distance, temperature, and a dozen other variables that meant the difference between a clean kill and a miss that got people killed. "Ma'am," Reeves said, setting her own rifle case on the table, "is it true this is your last op?" Grace looked up from the Barrett. "That's the plan. After tonight, I'm done. Museum gets the rifle. I go home to my daughter." Reeves nodded slowly. She understood the pull of home, the weight of promises made to people who loved you. She also understood the pull of duty, the way combat got into your blood and made civilian life feel hollow and purposeless. "What will you do?" Reeves asked. "After?" Grace considered the question. She had spent 22 years as a soldier. She barely remembered what civilian life felt like. Teach, maybe. Pass on what Hartley taught me. Make sure the next generation knows how to stay alive. "You could teach me more," Reeves suggested. "I've still got a lot to learn." Grace smiled slightly. "You're better than you think, Anna. Trust your instincts. And remember what Hartley always said. Steady hand, clear eye, true heart. The shot matters less than knowing when to take it." They worked in companionable silence. Two women who had learned to speak the language of rifles and ranges, who understood that death delivered from 2 kilometers away was an art that required absolute precision and absolute conviction. Grace found comfort in the familiar ritual of preparation. Whatever doubt she carried about the mission, whatever guilt she felt about breaking her promise to Katie, the rifle was honest. It did not judge. It simply performed as designed, transforming intent into outcome with mathematical precision. At 1900 hours, the team assembled in the briefing room for final mission overview. Grace took stock of the soldiers who would be going into the mountains with her. Master Sergeant Tom Briggs, 48 years old, had come up through the Gulf War and carried the weathered look of a man who had seen combat in all its ugly variations. He was the saw gunner, responsible for laying down suppressing fire when things went sideways. Grace trusted him absolutely. Sergeant First Class Martinez she already knew better than most of her own family. He would handle medical support and communications, keeping the team connected and keeping them alive when they took hits. Staff Sergeant Reeves would serve as second sniper, providing overwatch when Grace needed to move or when 2 rifles were better than 1. Specialist David Chen was the youngest at 24, a combat engineer responsible for breaching obstacles and handling demolitions. He had the earnest intensity of a soldier who still believed combat was about good guys versus bad guys, who had not yet learned that war was mostly about young men dying far from home for reasons politicians could barely articulate. And there was Major Blackwood, standing at the head of the table with maps and satellite imagery, briefing an operation that Grace's instincts told her was flawed from conception. "The insertion point," Blackwood was saying, "is here. Valley approach, fast rope from the Black Hawk, establish perimeter, move to the compound where Kessler is being held. Captain Keller provides overwatch from this ridge. Sergeant Reeves covers the extraction point. We get in, secure the package, get out. Total time on target, 30 minutes. Grace studied the map and saw a dozen ways the operation could fail. She saw ambush points and kill zones. She saw terrain that favored defenders over attackers. She saw a plan that assumed everything would go exactly as briefed, which in her experience meant everything would go exactly wrong. "Sir," she said carefully, "what's our contingency if the compound is more heavily defended than intelligence suggests?" Blackwood looked at her with barely concealed irritation. "Then we adapt. That's why I want our best assets on Overwatch. You drop anything that moves against us." Grace nodded but felt her unease growing. Blackwood was talking like a man who had never watched plans dissolve under enemy fire, who had never felt the sick certainty that comes when you realize you have walked into a trap and the only way out is through blood and bullets. Martinez caught her eye and gave a subtle shake of his head. He felt it too, the wrongness that Grace could not quite name. "Questions?" Blackwood asked the room. Briggs raised a hand. "Sir, what about air support? If we get pinned down, what's our extraction timeline?" Blackwood hesitated just for a fraction of a second, but Grace saw it. "Air support will be on standby," he said. "Call sign Phantom 2-1. But weather conditions mean they may not be able to reach us immediately. We need to plan for self-extraction." Translation: they were going in with minimal backup into hostile terrain during a blizzard on Christmas Eve, relying on intelligence that might be hours or days old. Grace had operated under worse conditions, but never with a commander whose judgment she doubted. All right, Blackwood concluded. Final equipment check at 2000 hours. Wheels up at 2100. Get some rest if you can. It's going to be a long night. The team dispersed. Grace remained at the table, studying the map one more time, trying to see what her instincts were warning her about. Martinez approached, voice low. You feel it too, he said. Something's wrong. Grace nodded slowly. I don't trust him, not his competence, his judgment. He's making decisions for the wrong reasons. What reasons? Grace thought about the look she had seen in Blackwood's eyes during the briefing. The edge of something that felt like ambition mixed with resentment. He wants to prove something, wants to show he can command an operation like this without the old guard holding his hand. And soldiers who need to prove something get other soldiers killed. Martinez was quiet for a moment. You want to back out? Grace almost laughed. After giving my commanding general my word? After breaking my promise to Katie to be here? No, we go. But we stay alert. And if things go wrong, we don't wait for Blackwood to figure out he's made a mistake. We act. Martinez nodded. Understood, ma'am. Grace left the briefing room and made her way to the barracks. She had 2 hours before departure, 2 hours to rest and prepare her mind for what was coming. She lay on a bunk in the dim quiet and thought about her father, about the photograph of him in his dress greens, 19 years old and immortal in his youth, with no idea that death was waiting for him in a jungle 8 months in his future. She thought about Hartley, bleeding out in her arms, making her promise to finish the mission. She thought about Katie, watching out a window for a mother who had broken her promise. She thought about 3 generations of Kellers who had served, who had sacrificed, who had kept their word even when it cost them everything. Grace closed her eyes and tried to sleep. The dreams that came were familiar. Firefights and dust and the weight of her rifle. In the dreams, she was always searching for something she could not quite find, always climbing toward a ridge she could not quite reach. She had been having these dreams for 22 years. She suspected she would have them for the rest of her life, however long that might be. At 2000 hours, she rose, checked her equipment one final time, and made her way to the flight line. The Black Hawk sat waiting on the tarmac, rotor blades still, crew already aboard running pre-flight checks. The night was cold and clear, stars visible overhead in the gaps between clouds. Somewhere 3,000 miles away, Katie was probably in bed, maybe thinking about Christmas morning, maybe wondering why her mother had broken another promise. Grace climbed aboard the helicopter. The team was already strapped in, Martinez across from her, Briggs by the door gun, Reeves checking her rifle scope, Chen reviewing demolitions procedures on a tablet. Blackwood was forward with the pilots, radio headset on, speaking in low tones. The engines spooled up. The rotors began to turn. Grace felt the familiar vibration as the Black Hawk lifted off, felt the earth drop away beneath them. She looked out the open door at Fort Bragg falling away below, at the lights of buildings where she had spent 6 years, where she had transformed from a soldier into a legend called Ghost. She wondered if she would see those lights again. She wondered if Katie would forgive her for this final broken promise. She wondered what her father had thought in his final moments, whether he had regretted the choices that brought him to a jungle half a world from home. The Black Hawk turned north and climbed toward cruising altitude. Grace checked her rifle one more time, then settled back against the bulkhead and watched the night scroll past below. Martinez leaned close, speaking just loud enough to be heard over the engine noise. You okay, ma'am? Grace thought about the question. She thought about duty and doubt, about promises made and promises broken, about the cost of service that never appeared on recruiting posters. Ask me tomorrow, she said. The Black Hawk flew on through darkness toward mountains and blizzards, in a mission that Grace's instincts told her was wrong in ways she could not yet articulate. Somewhere ahead waited betrayal and survival, and a test that would ask her to become something more than human just to stay alive. But Grace did not know that yet. She only knew that she was keeping a promise to a dead man, fulfilling a duty she had sworn to uphold, walking a path that 3 generations of Kellers had walked before her. She only knew that this was supposed to be her last mission. She only knew that in 6 hours she would fall through darkness and snow toward what should have been her death, and that everything she believed about duty and honor and service would be tested in ways that would either break her or forge her into something harder than steel. But that was still hours away. For now, the Black Hawk flew on through winter night, carrying soldiers toward war, carrying Grace toward a reckoning she could not yet imagine. Behind them, Fort Bragg disappeared into darkness. Ahead, the Caucasus Mountains waited, ancient and pitiless, ready to receive whatever sacrifices the night would demand. The blizzard descended on the Caucasus Mountains like the wrath of an indifferent god. Wind screamed through jagged peaks at velocities that turned snowflakes into razors. Visibility collapsed to nothing, a white void that erased the distinction between earth and sky, between up and down, between life and the cold that wanted to claim it. The temperature had fallen to -30 Celsius and was still dropping. Inside the Black Hawk, Grace Keller felt the aircraft shudder as crosswinds hammered the fuselage. The pilots were fighting for control, wrestling with instruments that struggled to distinguish terrain from clouds from the white chaos that had swallowed the world. She sat near the open door, Barrett M82 secured between her knees, watching terrain flash past in brief glimpses through gaps in the storm. 2 minutes to landing zone, the pilot's voice crackled through headsets. His tone carried the tight control of a man who knew he was asking his aircraft to perform beyond safe parameters, but had no choice except to try. Major Ryan Blackwood sat across from Grace, jaw clenched, hands gripping his carbine with white-knuckle intensity. He had been silent since they entered the storm 20 minutes ago. Now he leaned forward, keying his radio. "All teams, be ready. Fast rope on my mark. 30 seconds on target, then we move to Rally Point Alpha." Grace said nothing. She was calculating wind speed, visibility, the likelihood that they could insert 6 soldiers in these conditions without someone breaking an ankle or worse. She was thinking about the valley approach, about how exposed they would be, about every tactical concern she had raised in the briefing that Blackwood had dismissed. Martinez caught her eye from his position by the other door. His expression said what words could not. "This is wrong, this is bad, we should abort." But neither of them had the authority to override a mission commander. All they could do was stay alert and react when things went sideways. Because things always went sideways. The Black Hawk dropped altitude, rotors screaming in protest as wind tried to flip the aircraft like a toy. Grace braced herself against the bulkhead and watched the approach through her rifle scope. Through brief tears in the storm, she caught glimpses of the valley below. Rock faces, ice, a narrow saddle where they were supposed to rope down and establish perimeter. She saw something else too, a heat signature, wrong angle for friendly forces, positioned exactly where an ambush team would wait. "RPG," Grace shouted into her headset. 9 o'clock, 200 meters. The rocket-propelled grenade streaked through the blizzard like a finger of fire, trailing smoke that the wind tore apart before it could form a coherent line. The pilot yanked the stick hard left. The Black Hawk rolled, and Grace felt her stomach drop as the world spun. The RPG missed by 15 meters and exploded against the cliff face behind them, the concussion wave hitting the aircraft like a physical blow. But the explosion was not the main attack. It was the signal. Muzzle flashes erupted from 3 positions in the valley below. Tracer rounds carved red lines through the white chaos, converging on the Black Hawk from multiple angles. Grace heard bullets punch through thin aluminum skin, heard them spark off metal, heard the co-pilot scream as his instrument panel shattered and sent shrapnel into his face. "Taking fire," the pilot yelled. "Multiple positions. We're hit." Grace moved on instinct that had been carved into her nervous system by 2 decades in combat zones. She braced herself in the doorway, Barrett swinging up to her shoulder despite the aircraft's violent motion. Through the scope, the world narrowed to thermal signatures and ballistic mathematics. Her brain processed variables faster than conscious thought could follow. Helicopter spin rate, crosswind velocity, distance to target, the 17 different factors that determined whether a bullet would find its mark or disappear into the storm. She exhaled halfway and squeezed the trigger. The Barrett roared. The recoil tried to tear her from the doorway, but her harness held. Through the scope, she saw the thermal signature collapse, saw a man who'd been trying to kill them drop into snow that would be his grave. "One down," she called over the radio. She shifted targets, found the second shooter. The Black Hawk was spinning now, making accurate fire nearly impossible. But Grace had trained for impossible. She had spent 22 years learning to shoot from moving vehicles, from unstable platforms, from positions where most soldiers could not even maintain sight picture. She waited for the rotation to bring her around, led the target by 2 meters to account for their motion, and fired. 2 down. The third shooter was smart. had repositioned behind cover after seeing his partners drop. Grace could not get a clean shot, but she could suppress him, could force him to choose between staying hidden and maintaining fire on the Blackhawk. She put 2 rounds through the rock he was hiding behind. The bullets did not penetrate, but the message was clear. I know where you are and I can kill you if you move. The pilot used those 3 seconds of suppression to pull them out of the death spiral. The Blackhawk leveled out, barely, flying sideways at dangerous speed. They cleared the valley, rotors screaming in mechanical agony, smoke now pouring thick and black from the engine compartment. Everyone check in, Blackwood shouted, his voice higher than it should have been, touched by the edge of panic that came when a man realized he had walked his team into an ambush. The 6-person team sounded off. Minor injuries, nothing immediately life-threatening, but the aircraft was dying. Grace could hear it in the engine. Note, could see it in the way smoke was turning from gray to black, could feel it in the way the Black Hawk was losing altitude despite the pilot's best efforts. We need to put down now, the pilot said, and Grace heard in his voice the controlled terror of a man who knew his machine was about to fall out of the sky. 90 seconds before this bird drops like a stone. Grace scanned the terrain through the scope. There, she called, pointing to a narrow saddle between 2 peaks. Flat enough, we can defend it. Blackwood hesitated, and in that hesitation, Grace saw something that made her blood run cold. Not fear, not combat shock, but calculation. As if he was weighing options that had nothing to do with the team's survival and everything to do with something else, something she could not yet see clearly. Do it, Blackwood finally ordered the pilot. The Blackhawk limped toward the saddle, losing altitude with every meter. They were 30 feet up when the engine finally ceased completely. The aircraft dropped, hit hard, skidded 15 feet across ice and rock before coming to rest at a 45-degree angle. Grace was already moving before the skids stopped sliding. She grabbed her pack, her rifle, kicked open the door. Out, she commanded. Everyone out before she catches fire. The team poured from the dying machine. Martinez dragged Chen, who had taken shrapnel, to the shoulder. Briggs and Reeves provided cover, scanning the storm for hostiles. The pilots evacuated last, pulling emergency packs from the cockpit. 10 seconds later, flames erupted from the engine compartment. The Blackhawk's fuel ignited with a deep whump that Grace felt in her chest. Orange light turned the swirling snow into a scene from hell, then faded to red, then to black as the aircraft was consumed. Move back, Grace ordered. 20 meters. Find defensive positions. The team scattered into rocks as their transportation burned. Grace positioned herself behind a boulder that offered cover and a clear view down the valley. Through her scope, she scanned for pursuit. The storm made thermal imaging difficult, but she caught movement. Multiple signatures, at least 12 hostiles, climbing toward their position. Contact, Grace called. Valley approach. 12 plus, 400 meters and closing. Martinez moved to her position, working his portable radio unit. His face was illuminated by the green glow of the screen, highlighting the concentration in his eyes as he tried to raise command. Nothing, he said after a minute. The crash must have damaged the main transmitter, and this storm is blocking everything else. I can't get signal. Keep trying, Blackwood ordered. He was crouched nearby, radio in his own hand, but Grace noticed he was not trying to reach command. He was on a different frequency, speaking low, his back turned to the team. Red flag number 2. Grace filed it away and returned to her scope. They knew we were coming, Briggs said, voicing what everyone was thinking. That wasn't opportunistic. That was a prepared ambush. Intel leak, Reeves muttered, checking her rifle. Someone sold us out. Grace said nothing. Her mind was working through probabilities and possibilities. The mission had been classified, distribution limited to essential personnel only. The leak had to come from inside their own chain of command. But that was a problem for later. Right now, survival was the only priority. Sir, she said to Blackwood, recommend we move to higher ground. This position is defensible short-term, but if they get above us, we're finished. Blackwood looked at her, and again Grace saw that calculation in his eyes. That sense of a man weighing options that had nothing to do with tactics and everything to do with motives she could not yet understand. Negative, Blackwood said. We hold here until Martinez reestablishes communication. It was the wrong call. Every instinct Grace had developed over 22 years screamed that it was wrong. They needed mobility, needed the high ground, needed to be anywhere except pinned in this saddle with hostile forces closing from below. But Blackwood was the ranking officer, and Grace had spent her entire career learning to trust the chain of command, even when she disagreed with it. "Understood, sir," she said. She returned to her scope. The hostiles had closed to 300 meters. Through gaps in the storm, she caught glimpses of military-grade equipment, night vision, coordinated hand signals. These were not militia. These were trained soldiers who knew exactly where to find 6 Americans stranded on a mountain. Grace waited for a lull in the wind. She found her first target, the point man advancing ahead of his team. She calculated distance, wind speed, the bullet drop over 300 meters in sub-zero temperatures. The math happened in the part of her brain that did not need conscious thought, the part that had been trained by Hartley to process ballistics the way most people processed breathing. She fired. The point man dropped, thermal signature going cold as his body heat began leaking into frozen ground. "Confirmed kill," Grace said quietly. 11 remaining. The hostile formation scattered, seeking cover. Grace tracked their movement, looking for the next target, the next threat to her team. Behind her, she heard Blackwood moving, heard his boots on rock. She assumed he was repositioning, getting a better view of the approaching force. She assumed wrong. "Sergeant Keller," Blackwood's voice came from directly behind her. "Too close. I need to discuss tactical options." Grace kept her eye to the scope, tracking targets. "Bit busy at the moment, sir." "Now, Sergeant." Something in his tone made her pause. Grace lifted her head, turned to face him. Blackwood was standing 3 feet away, positioned between her and the rest of the team. His carbine was not pointed at her, but it was not pointed away either. His expression carried something Grace recognized from combat zones, from moments when soldiers had to make decisions that would haunt them forever. "Sir," she said carefully. "You saved our lives down there," Blackwood said. His voice was quiet, almost sad. "You're a hell of a soldier, Keller. That makes this harder." Grace's hand dropped toward her sidearm, but she knew before she moved that she was already too late. Blackwood's eyes flicked to something behind her, and Grace understood in that instant what was about to happen, understood that she had walked into something far worse than a simple ambush. "You set us up," she said softly. "This was you." His jaw clenched. "They promised me you would be alone on Overwatch. This was supposed to be clean." "Who promised you?" But Grace already knew. The enemy had bought him. How much, she did not know. Why, she could guess. Jealousy, resentment, ambition. Maybe just the simple corruption that happened when a man decided personal advancement mattered more than the soldiers whose lives he was supposed to protect. "I'm sorry, Grace," Blackwood said. Then he lunged forward and shoved her backward with both hands. Grace's back hit the boulder behind her, and then there was nothing. Just air and snow, and the terrible sensation of falling. Her training kicked in immediately. She pulled her limbs in tight, tried to protect her head, felt the barrette torn from her grip by violent rotation. The world became a chaos of white and black, spinning, tumbling, acceleration without control. She caught a glimpse of rocky walls flashing past too fast to comprehend. She hit something hard. The impact drove air from her lungs, sent white agony through her left side. She felt ribs crack, felt her shoulder wrench out of socket, but the impact arrested her fall partially. She was on a slope now, sliding, still moving down, but slower. Grace spread her arms and legs, trying to create drag, trying to slow herself further. Her gloved hands clawed at ice and rock. The world was still spinning, still white, still terrible. Another impact, this one against her right leg. More pain, sharp and immediate, but she was definitely slowing now. Then the slope ended, and Grace fell through open air for what felt like forever, but was probably only 3 seconds. This time when she hit it was into deep snow. The powder exploded around her, swallowed her whole. She went under, down into cold that burned like fire. Darkness took her. Pain brought her back. Her left side was screaming, each breath a knife between broken ribs. Her right shoulder felt disconnected, wrong in ways that made her stomach turn. Cold had seeped into every part of her body, hypothermia already beginning its deadly work. Grace opened her eyes to absolute darkness. She was buried in snow, completely covered, unable to see anything beyond the white that pressed against her face. For one terrible second, panic seized her. Buried alive, unable to move, the snow a frozen coffin, death by suffocation or freezing, whichever came first. Then training reasserted itself. The voice in her head was Hartley's voice, calm and steady. Don't panic, Keller. Panic kills faster than cold. Assess, adapt, overcome. Grace moved her right hand experimentally, fingers numb but functional. She could move her arm despite the separated shoulder. Her left arm was less responsive, pinned awkwardly beneath her body. She began to dig, slowly, methodically, pushing snow away from her face, creating a small air pocket. Each movement sent fire through her broken ribs, but she kept digging, one handful at a time. She had no idea how deep she was buried. 5 feet? 10? Did it matter? The only direction that mattered was up. Her breath came in short gasps. The air pocket was small and getting smaller as snow collapsed into the space she created. Grace forced herself to slow down, to be methodical. Panic was the enemy. Haste would get her killed as surely as the cold. She dug upward. Minutes passed, or maybe hours, time losing meaning in the darkness and the cold. Her fingers were losing sensation. Frostbite was a real danger, but she kept digging because the alternative was dying here in the snow, 70 feet down a cliff face, while her team died above and her daughter waited at home for a mother who would never return. Grace thought about Katie, 14 years old, probably sitting by a window right now, watching for headlights that would not come. She thought about the promise she had broken, about the retirement that had been just hours away. She thought about her father dead in Vietnam before she could know him, and about Hartley, bleeding out in Afghanistan after making her promise to finish the mission. She kept digging. Her hand broke through into open air. Grace forced her way out of the snow, like something being born, gasping, fighting, refusing to let the mountain win. When she finally pulled herself free, she collapsed onto the surface, chest heaving despite the broken ribs. The blizzard still raged around her. She was at the bottom of a narrow ravine, walls of rock and ice rising on either side. Above, through the swirling white, she could barely make out the lip of the cliff she had fallen from. 60 feet, maybe 70. She should be dead. Grace lay in the snow for a long moment, taking inventory. 3 broken ribs, minimum. Right shoulder separated or dislocated, she could not tell which. Multiple contusions, probably internal bleeding. Early stage hypothermia. Her sidearm, she patted her thigh holster. Still there, thank God. Her knife still strapped to her belt. Her pack somehow still on her back, the straps having held through the entire fall. She had lost the Barrett. Hartley's rifle, the weapon she had carried through 3 wars, was gone somewhere in the snow and rock. The loss felt like losing a piece of herself, like losing the last physical connection to the man who had taught her what it meant to be a soldier. Grace pulled the pack off her shoulders, fumbled it open with hands that barely responded to her commands. Inside, she found her emergency kit, miraculously intact. Chemical heat pack, she cracked it to activate, stuffed it inside her jacket against her core. Immediate warmth bloomed, fighting back the hypothermia that was trying to shut her body down. Medical supplies next. With her teeth in one hand, she managed to inject herself with morphine. Not too much, she needed to stay functional, but enough to take the edge off pain that was threatening to overwhelm rational thought. Then she found the thing that mattered most. A red and green scarf, hand-knitted, slightly too long, the stitches uneven in places where inexperienced hands had made mistakes. Katie had made it before Grace deployed, had insisted her mother take it. This will keep you warm and bring you home. Mommy babe, annoying. Grace wrapped it around her neck now, felt the scratchy wool against her skin. I'm coming home, baby, Grace whispered into the storm. I promise. She forced herself to her feet. The world spun, but she steadied herself against the ravine wall. She needed to find a way out. More than that, she needed to find her team. Blackwood had betrayed her, but the others were innocent. They were walking into a trap without knowing one of their own had sold them out. Grace looked up at the cliff face. Impossible to climb in her condition, even if it were not sheer ice. So she would find another way. She always found another way. That was what made her Ghost, the soldier who appeared where enemies thought no one could go, who survived conditions that killed everyone else. She began to move through the ravine, using the wall for support, her good hand on her sidearm. The storm made visibility nearly zero, but that worked in her favor as much as against her. She was trained for this, for movement in extreme conditions, for navigation when every sense screamed confusion. The ravine sloped gradually upward. If she followed it long enough, it would lead back to higher ground. The question was whether she would survive long enough to get there. Grace walked. Each step was agony. Her ribs ground against each other with every breath. The morphine was wearing off, and pain returned in waves. The cold was trying to pull her down, whispering that she should just rest, just for a moment, just close her eyes. She thought about Emma. No, not Emma, Katie. Her daughter's name was Katie, and she was waiting at home, and Grace had promised to be there. She thought about Hartley's last words. Promise me you'll finish the mission, whatever it takes. She kept walking. After 20 minutes, she heard it. The distant crack of gunfire, barely audible over the storm. Her team. They were still fighting, which meant they were still alive. Grace adjusted her course, moving toward the sound. The ravine narrowed, became a crack in stone barely wide enough for her to squeeze through. Her separated shoulders screamed as she forced herself through the gap. On the other side, the ravine opened into a wider valley. There, barely visible through the snow, she saw lights, muzzle flashes. The battle was maybe half a mile away, upslope from her current position. Grace assessed her tactical situation with the cold clarity that came from 2 decades in combat. No rifle, no communications equipment, severe injuries, one sidearm with 2 spare magazines, no backup, no support, against at least a dozen hostiles and a traitor who thought she was dead. The smart play was to hunker down, wait for the storm to pass, try to make her way to friendly territory. But her team would be dead by then. Her team, the soldiers who trusted her, who had followed her into combat, who did not know they were being led by a man who had sold them out. Grace checked her pistol. Sig Sauer P226, 15 rounds in the magazine, 2 spare magazines in her pack, 45 rounds total. She was one of the best shots in the Rangers, but pistol accuracy beyond 50 meters in a blizzard was nearly impossible. So she would have to get close. She started moving upslope. Each step was deliberate, measured, fighting against pain and cold and the body that was trying to shut down. The morphine was completely gone now, and agony returned in full force. Grace welcomed it. Pain meant she was alive. Pain meant she was functional. The gunfire grew louder as she climbed. She could hear the distinct patterns now. The steady, disciplined fire of her team, the more numerous but less controlled shooting of the hostiles. Her team was pinned down, probably low on ammunition, waiting for an extraction that was not coming because Blackwood had sabotaged their communications. Grace found an outcropping of rock that gave her a view of the battlefield. Through the storm, she could make out positions. Her team had taken cover in a cluster of boulders about 200 meters from her location. The hostiles had them surrounded on 3 sides, slowly tightening the noose. And there was Blackwood, positioned with the team, firing his carbine, playing the role of heroic officer defending his people. The rage that went through Grace was cold and surgical. She did not let it control her. She used it. She moved laterally, circling around the hostile position. She needed a better angle, needed to get behind them. The storm was her ally now. She was invisible in the white, a ghost moving through snow, exactly what her call sign promised. She found what she was looking for, a position on the flank, elevated with clear sight lines to 3 of the hostile positions. She was maybe 40 meters from the nearest one, within effective range, even with a pistol if she made every shot count. Grace settled into a prone position behind a fallen log, ignoring the way her ribs grated against each other. She braced her pistol on the log, used her injured left arm despite the pain to steady her shooting hand. Through the snow, she picked her first target, a hostile soldier separated slightly from his team, focused on the Ranger's position, unaware that death was sighting him from 40 meters away. Grace controlled her breathing. In combat, breathing was everything. Hartley had taught her that. Steady hand, clear eye, true heart. The shot was not about the gun or the bullet. It was about the moment between heartbeats when the body was perfectly still, when the world narrowed to just the sight picture and the target and the squeeze of the trigger. She fired. The SIG barked once. The target dropped. Before anyone could react, Grace shifted to the second target, fired again, watched him fall. The third target was turning, trying to locate the threat. She put 2 rounds center mass. Then she moved. Critical rule of fieldcraft: never stay in the same position after firing. She scrambled 10 meters to the right, found new cover behind a boulder. The hostiles were confused now, firing randomly into the storm, trying to find an enemy they could not see. But Blackwood knew. Through a gap in the snow, Grace saw him standing, scanning the area, his expression tight with something that looked like fear. He knew she was alive. He understood that the soldier he had tried to murder had crawled back from the abyss and was now hunting his hunters. Grace could take the shot, 40 meters, clear line of sight. She could put a bullet through his skull, end this right now. But she needed him alive, needed him to answer for what he had done, needed the team to know the truth. So instead she fired at the hostile nearest to Blackwood. The man dropped and Blackwood flinched, ducked behind cover, realizing that Ghost was out there in the storm and she was not interested in mercy. Grace moved again, found a new position, fired 3 more times. 2 hostiles down, 1 forced to retreat. The tide was turning. The Rangers, given this unexpected support, pressed their advantage. Briggs had his saw up now, laying down suppressing fire. Reeves moved forward, using the cover fire to advance on hostile positions. Grace kept moving, kept firing. She was burning through ammunition, but it was working. The hostiles were breaking, falling back in disorder. Then her pistol clicked empty. Last magazine. She reloaded, hands moving on muscle memory that had been carved into her nervous system by thousands of repetitions. 15 rounds left. She had to make them count. She saw Martinez trying to move to a better position to work on communications equipment. A hostile spotted him, raised his rifle. Grace's bullet found the hostile's chest before he could fire. Martinez looked around, bewildered, seeing his would-be killer fall from an unseen shot. "Ghost," she heard him say, wonder in his voice. "The snow ghost is back." Blackwood was screaming into his radio now. "Fall back to secondary position. Move, move." He was trying to regroup, trying to regain control of a situation that was rapidly spiraling away from him. Grace watched him from her position 50 meters away, tracking his movements through the storm. The Rangers were responding to his orders, years of training overriding their confusion about the mysterious sniper who had turned the tide of battle. They moved in disciplined pairs, covering each other as they retreated toward a narrow canyon that Blackwood was indicating. Grace's blood went cold. She knew that canyon, had studied terrain maps before the mission. It was a natural choke point, defensible from inside, but only if you controlled the heights on either side. If the enemy controlled those heights, it became a killing box, a place where soldiers went to die. Blackwood was leading them into another trap. Grace tried her emergency radio, the short-range unit in her pack that she had not thought to check until now. It was damaged from the fall, casing cracked, but when she toggled it on, static hissed through the speaker. "Team 17, this is Keller," she transmitted. "Do not proceed to canyon. Repeat, do not proceed to canyon. It's a trap." Static. No response. Either they could not hear her or the radio was only receiving, not transmitting. Grace watched helplessly as the Rangers moved into the canyon, Blackwood urging them forward, always at the rear, always pushing them deeper into the trap. The remaining hostiles, she counted 8 still combat effective, were pulling back but not retreating. They were repositioning, moving to the heights above the canyon exactly as Grace had feared. She started moving. Her body was failing now, the combination of injuries and exertion and cold reaching critical levels. She stumbled, caught herself, kept going. She had maybe 15 minutes before hypothermia took her ability to function. Maybe less, but she could not let her team walk into that canyon, could not let Blackwood complete his betrayal, could not fail the soldiers who trusted her. Grace circled wide, trying to get ahead of the Rangers, trying to reach the canyon before they were completely trapped. Her vision was tunneling now, consciousness flickering at the edges. The scarf around her neck seemed to tighten. No, not the scarf. Her throat was swelling from internal injuries, making it hard to breathe. "Not yet," she told herself. "Not yet. Katie is waiting. The team is counting on you. Not yet." She reached the canyon entrance and took cover behind a boulder. The Rangers were 30 meters inside, taking defensive positions among the rocks. Blackwood was with them, checking ammunition counts, positioning them precisely where he wanted them. Above, on both sides, the hostiles were moving into position. She could see their shadows through the snow, dark shapes against white. Martinez was working frantically on communications equipment, trying to boost the signal, trying to reach command. He had no idea that Blackwood had sabotaged the antenna, that no help was coming. Briggs was on perimeter, his saw covering the approach. Reeves and Chen were treating each other's wounds. The pilots huddled in the center, exhausted and scared. 6 people who trusted their commanding officer. 6 people who were about to die because of that trust. Unless Grace could stop it. She checked her pistol, 12 rounds remaining against 8 hostiles on the heights plus Blackwood down in the canyon. The math was bad. The math was impossible. But Grace had beaten impossible before. She looked up at the heights, calculating angles, wind speed, the positions of the hostiles. They were moving into final positions, preparing to rain fire down into the canyon. She had maybe 2 minutes before they were ready. 2 minutes to act. Grace moved to the base of the left canyon wall, found hand and footholds in the ice-slicked rock. With her good arm, she began to climb. Each pull was agony. Her broken ribs ground together. Her separated shoulder felt like it was tearing free from her body. The cold had stolen most of the feeling from her fingers, but she climbed. 20 feet up, 30. She could see the first hostile position now, above and to her left. 2 soldiers setting up a machine gun, preparing to enfilade the canyon. 40 feet up. She was level with them now, maybe 15 meters away horizontally. Grace hooked her injured left arm through a crack in the rock, stabilizing herself despite the screaming pain. With her right hand, she drew her pistol. The hostiles were focused on the canyon below, on the rangers they were about to slaughter. They never looked to their flank, never imagined that a half-dead soldier was clinging to a cliff face in a blizzard with a pistol in the absolute conviction that she would not let her team die. Grace fired twice. Both soldiers dropped. She was already moving, traversing laterally across the cliff face toward the second position. Her body was operating beyond conscious control now, running on training and will and the promise she had made to Katie and the promise she had made to Hartley and the legacy of 3 generations of Kellers who had served and sacrificed and kept their word even when it cost them everything. The second position held 3 soldiers. They were turning now, alerted by the shots, searching for the threat. Grace fired 3 times. 2 dropped. The third got his rifle up, spraying bullets wild into the storm. 1 round caught Grace's left leg just above the knee. She felt the impact, felt the leg go numb, felt her grip on the rock weaken. She fired her last shot. The hostile fell backward off the cliff. Then Grace was falling too. She hit the canyon floor hard, 20 feet down, landing on her already broken side. This time when the darkness came, she almost let it take her. Almost. But through the roaring in her ears, she heard voices. Keller! Jesus Christ, it's Keller! Hands on her, multiple pairs, lifting her carefully. Martinez's face above her, shocked and awed and scared. You're alive, he breathed. We thought... Blackwood said you fell. Trap, Grace managed to say. Blood in her mouth. Blackwood, traitor, get out now. Martinez's eyes went wide. He looked up toward where Blackwood was standing, staring at Grace like she was a ghost risen from hell. Sir, Martinez said, voice uncertain. Blackwood's hand dropped to his sidearm. Briggs had his saw pointed at Blackwood before the major's fingers even touched his holster. Don't, Briggs said, voice flat and cold. Don't even think about it, sir. Blackwood froze. His eyes darted between Briggs, Martinez, and the other rangers who were now all looking at him with expressions ranging from confusion to dawning horror. She's delirious, Blackwood said quickly. The fall, the injuries. She doesn't know what she's saying. We need to get her medical attention. Reeves had her rifle aimed at Blackwood now, too. We heard the radio intercepts, sir. After you left the perimeter, enemy forces knew our exact position, our planned route. Only way they could know that is if someone told them. And Ghost doesn't miss, Briggs added. Doesn't fall, not unless someone pushes her. Grace tried to speak, but Martinez was already working on her, checking injuries with quick, efficient movements. His face was grim as his hands found broken ribs, the separated shoulder, the gunshot wound to the leg, the signs of severe hypothermia and probable internal bleeding. She needs a hospital, Martinez said. Soon, or she's not going to make it. Grace grabbed his wrist with her good hand. Team first, she gasped. Hostiles on the heights. More coming. Blackwood was leading you into a trap. As if to confirm her words, gunfire erupted from the right side canyon wall. The hostiles she had not been able to reach were opening fire, bullets sparking off rocks around the rangers. Contact right, Chen yelled. The team moved with practiced efficiency, scattering to cover positions, returning fire. Briggs's saw roared, suppressing the hostile positions. Blackwood was shouting orders, trying to reassert control, but no one was listening to him anymore. Reeves had him against the canyon wall, rifle in his face. keeping him out of the fight. Grace tried to stand, failed. Her leg would not support her weight. Martinez pushed her back down. "You've done enough," he said firmly. "Let them handle this." But Grace could see the tactical situation deteriorating. The Rangers were pinned down, taking fire from multiple positions, without support, without communications. Eventually, they would be overwhelmed. She needed to give them a chance. "My pack," she told Martinez. "Emergency beacon." Martinez found it, pulled out the device designed for situations exactly like this. A last-ditch satellite distress beacon that burned through encryption and atmospheric interference to send out a priority rescue signal. It took 2 minutes to lock onto satellites, and it would bring every hostile within 10 miles down on their position, but it was their only chance. Martinez activated the beacon. Somewhere above the storm, satellites were receiving the signal, triangulating their position, relaying information to command. Rescue was coming, if they could survive long enough to see it. The firefight intensified. The hostiles knew time was against them now, pressing their attack with desperate intensity. The Rangers gave ground reluctantly, using every boulder, every depression in the canyon floor for cover. Chen was hit, bullet grazing his helmet, knocking him down. Briggs dragged him to safety, never stopping his methodical fire on hostile positions. 1 minute since beacon activation. Grace pulled herself to a sitting position against a rock. She had no ammunition, no rifle, nothing to contribute except the knowledge that had gotten them this far. She studied the battlefield with eyes that had learned to read combat the way scholars read ancient texts. "The left approach," she called to Briggs. "There's a blind spot in your fire pattern. They'll try to flank through there." Briggs adjusted his aim. 3 hostiles tried to push through exactly where Grace had predicted. The saw cut them down. 90 seconds. More hostiles were arriving now, drawn by the sound of battle. The Rangers were facing a dozen enemy soldiers, maybe more. Ammunition was running low. Martinez was bleeding from a fragment wound to the shoulder, but still working, still trying to keep everyone alive. And Blackwood was watching it all with hollow eyes, seeing his plan fall apart, seeing the team he had betrayed fighting to survive despite his treachery. 2 minutes. Martinez's radio crackled to life. "Team 17, this is Phantom 2-1. We have your beacon. Inbound your position. ETA 8 minutes. Mark your perimeter with IR strobes." 8 minutes. They had to hold for 8 more minutes. The hostiles seemed to sense it too, their attack reaching fever pitch. They were trying to overrun the position before air support arrived, throwing bodies at the Rangers in wave attacks. Briggs's saw ran dry. He dropped it, grabbed his rifle, kept firing. Chen took a round through his good shoulder. Both shoulders now bleeding, but he propped himself against a rock and kept shooting. The pilots, useless for flying, but functional for fighting, were loading magazines, passing ammunition, doing what they could. 7 minutes, 6. The hostiles pulled back, regrouping for one final push. In the brief lull, Grace could hear rotors in the distance, growing louder. 5 minutes. The hostiles charged. They came from both sides of the canyon simultaneously. A coordinated assault meant to overwhelm the Rangers through sheer numbers, 15, maybe 20 soldiers screaming as they attacked. The Rangers met them with everything they had left. Briggs fighting despite exhaustion. Chen bleeding from both shoulders but still aiming true. Martinez concussed but functional, his rifle barking steadily. Reeves one-handed shooting over the wounded she was supposed to be protecting. And they were being pushed back, step by step, boulder by boulder. The hostiles were winning. Grace saw Blackwood make his move. While everyone was focused on the assault, he had worked his bound hands in front of him, reached for a fallen rifle. She saw him raise it, saw him aim at Martinez's back, saw the calculation in his eyes as he decided that if he was going down, he would take someone with him. Grace tried to shout a warning, but her voice was lost in the chaos of gunfire and screaming and the rotors that were getting closer but not close enough. Martinez was going to die, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Then Reeves turned. She saw Blackwood, saw the rifle, saw the threat. Her own rifle came up and fired twice. Blackwood fell, surprise frozen on his face, the rifle clattering from his hands. "Traitor," Reeves said simply. 3 minutes. The rotors were loud now, close enough that Grace could feel them through the ground. Through the storm, she saw them. 2 Apache gunships running lights off, thermal sights painting the battlefield with invisible light. "Friendlies, mark your position," the lead Apache called. Martinez activated an IR strobe. To the naked eye, it was barely visible in the storm. To the Apache's sensors, it was a lighthouse in the darkness. "Targets acquired," the Apache pilot said, and Grace heard in his voice the cold satisfaction of a predator who had found prey. Engaging. The 30-millimeter chain guns opened up with a sound like the world tearing apart. High explosive rounds walked through the hostile positions with mechanical precision, each burst finding its target with computer-guided accuracy. The hostiles broke, tried to run. The Apaches pursued them, relentless and merciless. In 30 seconds, it was over. The canyon fell silent except for the wind and the rotors and the labored breathing of 6 rangers who had somehow survived the impossible. A Blackhawk descended into the canyon, different from the one they had crashed in, but the same in all the ways that mattered. Medics were already moving before the skids touched ground, swarming the wounded with swift efficiency. Grace felt hands on her, felt needles in her arm, felt the cold darkness creeping in now that the fight was over, now that she could finally stop pushing her body beyond human limits. "Stay with us, Sergeant," a medic said. "You're not done yet." But Grace was fading. The adrenaline that had kept her moving, kept her fighting, was gone. There was nothing left except the promise she had made. "Katie," Grace whispered, "tell my daughter I'm coming home." "You'll tell her yourself," the medic said firmly. "You're going to make it. You hear me? You're going to make it." The last thing Grace saw before darkness took her completely was Martinez standing over Blackwood's body, face twisted with betrayal and grief. Then nothing. The Blackhawk lifted off, carrying the wounded toward safety, carrying Grace toward a hospital and a recovery and a reckoning with everything that had happened on this mountain. But that was still hours away, still uncertain. For now, there was only darkness and pain and the morphine that the medics were pushing through her IV and the sound of rotors cutting through storm as they carried her away from the mountain that had tried to kill her and failed. Katie was waiting. Hartley's promise still needed to be kept. The mission was not finished. But Grace was alive. Against all odds, against all probability, she had survived. The ghost had returned from the abyss. And when she woke, when she could finally speak again, there would be questions to answer and truths to face and a daughter who deserved to know why her mother had broken another promise. But that was tomorrow. Tonight, Grace Keller slept the sleep of the utterly exhausted, flying through darkness toward home. Grace Keller woke to whiteness, not the white of snow or storm or the frozen hell she had left behind in the Caucasus Mountains, but the sterile white of hospital ceiling tiles, fluorescent lights humming overhead, with the mechanical indifference of machines that knew nothing of combat or cold or the cost of promises kept. Pain was the second thing she noticed. Not the sharp agony of broken ribs or separated shoulders or gunshot wounds, but the duller ache that came after surgery, after medications, after skilled hands had put shattered pieces back together, as well as human knowledge allowed. Her left side was wrapped tight in bandages. Her right shoulder was immobilized in a complex brace. Her left leg, where the bullet had found her on that cliff face, throbbed with a rhythm that matched her heartbeat. The third thing she noticed was the hand holding hers. Small fingers, warm and alive, gripping her right hand with the desperate intensity of someone who had been terrified of letting go. Grace turned her head, slowly because even that simple motion sent waves of discomfort through her body, and found herself looking at her daughter. Katie sat in a chair pulled close to the hospital bed. She was 14 years old, dark hair falling across her face, eyes red from crying but open now, and focused on her mother with an expression that Grace recognized because she had worn it herself at age 2, when strangers in uniform had come to tell her mother that Sergeant William Keller would not be coming home from Vietnam. "Mom," Katie whispered, "you're awake." Grace tried to speak, but her throat was dry, raw from intubation. A cup appeared, held by another hand, and Grace shifted her gaze to find her mother standing beside the bed. Margaret Keller was 68 years old now, white-haired and weathered by 7 decades of life that had included bearing a husband, raising a daughter alone, and watching that daughter walk the same path that had taken her husband. "Easy," Margaret said, holding the cup to Grace's lips. Small sips. The water was cold and perfect. Grace drank, felt her throat begin to work again, felt words become possible. "How long?" she managed. "3 days," Margaret said. "You've been in and out. They had to do 3 surgeries. The doctors said another hour and you wouldn't have made it." Grace looked at Katie, at the tears still drying on her daughter's face, at the red and green scarf wrapped around Katie's neck like a talisman against loss. The scarf Katie had knitted, the scarf Grace had worn in the mountains, the scarf that had survived everything and somehow made it home. "I'm sorry, baby," Grace said. "I promised I'd be home for Christmas." Katie's face crumpled and she leaned forward, carefully avoiding her mother's injuries, pressing her forehead against Grace's good shoulder. "I don't care about Christmas," she said, voice breaking. "I just wanted you to come home. I just wanted you alive." Grace felt tears on her own face now, hot against skin that had been frozen so recently. She lifted her good hand, stroked Katie's hair, and understood in that moment what her mother had tried to tell her on the phone 3 days ago. This was the cost that never appeared on recruiting posters, never showed up in award ceremonies or commendations. The cost was measured in tears shed by daughters who waited for mothers who went to war, in promises broken because duty demanded it, in the accumulating weight of choices that could not be unmade. "I'm here now," Grace whispered. "I'm here and I'm not going anywhere ever again." "That's what your father said." Margaret spoke quietly from the other side of the bed. "That's what they all say." Grace met her mother's eyes and saw there not accusation, but a weary understanding. The knowledge that came from being a military wife, a military mother, a woman who had spent her life waiting for people who served something larger than themselves and sometimes did not come home. "This time it's true," Grace said. "No more deployments, no more missions. I'm done, Mom. I'm really done." A knock on the door interrupted them. A doctor entered, white coat and tired eyes that marked him as someone who spent his days putting broken soldiers back together and sending them either home or back to war. He checked Grace's chart, examined her wounds with professional efficiency, asked questions about pain levels and range of motion. "Captain Keller," the doctor said finally, "you're incredibly lucky. 3 broken ribs, separated shoulder, gunshot wound to the leg, severe hypothermia, mild internal bleeding. By all rights, you should be dead." "But I'm not," Grace said. "No, you're not." The doctor's expression carried something that might have been respect or might have been the exhaustion of a man who had seen too many soldiers try to beat impossible odds. "You'll be here another week, minimum. Then physical therapy for at least 3 months. Full recovery, if you're lucky, 6 months to a year." Grace nodded. She had known it would be bad, had felt her body breaking on that mountain, had pushed it beyond human limits because the alternative was death or watching her team die. Now she would pay the price of that choice in months of rehabilitation, in pain that would become familiar as a companion, in a body that would never quite work the way it had before. "Can I have visitors?" she asked. "My team, they need to know I'm okay." The doctor hesitated. "There are some people who want to see you. Military investigators. They have questions about what happened on that mountain." "Let them come," Grace said. "I have answers." The doctor left. Margaret took Katie's hand. "Why don't we give your mother some rest?" she suggested gently. "We can come back this evening." Katie looked like she wanted to protest, wanted to stay glued to her mother's side forever, never let her out of sight again. But she was 14 now, old enough to understand that adults sometimes needed time to handle adult problems, even if she did not like it. "Okay," Katie said quietly. "But you promise you'll be here when I get back? You won't go anywhere?" "I promise, baby." Grace squeezed her daughter's hand. "I'm not going anywhere without you ever again." They left. Grace lay alone in the white room and thought about promises and the cost of keeping them. She thought about Blackwood, dead on a mountain with his betrayal exposed. She thought about Hartley, dead in Afghanistan with a promise extracted that Grace had kept at nearly the cost of her own life. She thought about her father, dead in Vietnam before she could know him, and wondered what promises he had made and whether he had managed to keep them. The door opened again. This time it was not doctors or family, but soldiers. Sergeant First Class James Martinez entered first, arm in a sling, face showing the yellow-green of fading bruises. Behind him came Master Sergeant Tom Briggs, walking with a pronounced limp, both legs still healing from the wounds he had taken. Staff Sergeant Anna Reeves followed, bandage on her temple where shrapnel had carved a line that would scar. Specialist David Chen came last, both shoulders wrapped, moving gingerly but moving. "Ma'am," Martinez said, and Grace heard in his voice something she could not quite name. Relief, certainly. Respect, absolutely. But something else, too, something that sounded like awe. "Doc," Grace replied. She looked at each of them in turn, cataloging injuries, assessing their condition the way she always did with her team. "You all look like hell." "Right back at you, ma'am," Briggs said, and there was warmth in his gruff voice. "Though we hear you looked a lot worse 3 days ago." They pulled chairs close to the bed, arranged themselves the way soldiers do when preparing for a serious conversation. Martinez spoke first. "The investigators have been asking questions," he said, "about Blackwood, about what happened on that mountain. We've told them everything we know, but they want to hear it from you." Grace nodded slowly. "What did you tell them?" "The truth. That Blackwood pushed you off a cliff, that he was in communication with enemy forces, that he led us into an ambush and then tried to get us all killed in that canyon." Martinez's voice was flat, factual, but Grace could hear the anger underneath. "They found his radio equipment, found encrypted communications going back 8 months. He'd been selling information to the Russians for a long time." "Why?" Chen asked. And Grace heard in the young soldier's voice the bewilderment of someone whose faith in the system had been shattered. Why would he do that? Why? Grace thought about Blackwood's eyes as he pushed her, about the calculation she had seen there, the mixture of resentment and ambition and something that looked like self-loathing. "Jealousy, maybe," she said. "I was everything he wanted to be. Field promoted, combat proven, respected by the soldiers. He had the rank, but I had the authority that comes from leading people through hell and bringing them home alive. Some men can't handle that." "He got people killed," Reeves said quietly. "Not just us. The investigators say there were other missions he compromised. Other soldiers who died because of intelligence he sold." The room fell silent. They were thinking about brothers in arms who had died not in honest combat, but because a traitor had sold them out for money or advancement or whatever Blackwood had received in exchange for his betrayal. "There's going to be an investigation," Martinez said. "Full inquiry. They'll want depositions from all of us. It's going to take months." Grace understood what he was not saying. The investigation would be public, or as public as classified military inquiries could be. There would be questions about how Blackwood had gone undetected for so long, about failures in vetting and oversight, about the systems that were supposed to prevent exactly this kind of betrayal. Careers would be damaged. Reputations would suffer. The Rangers as an institution would have to answer for one of their own turning traitor. "Let them investigate," Grace said. "The truth needs to come out. If there are systemic failures, they need to be fixed so this never happens again." They talked for another hour. The team brought Grace up to speed on everything that had happened after the rescue. The Russian forces had scattered after the Apache attack. Intelligence had identified the enemy commander as Colonel Dmitry Volkov, a Spetsnaz officer with connections to organized crime and a history of selling military services to the highest bidder. He had escaped in the chaos, but was now wanted internationally. The CIA analyst they had been sent to rescue, Dr. Robert Kessler, had never existed. The entire mission had been fabricated by Blackwood and his Russian contacts as a way to eliminate Grace, who Blackwood saw as a threat to his continued operations. It had been a trap from the beginning, designed to kill the one soldier who might have noticed the inconsistencies in Blackwood's behavior and reported them. "How did you survive?" Chen asked suddenly. 70-foot fall in a blizzard with no equipment. The odds. "I promised my daughter I'd come home," Grace said simply. "Sometimes that's enough." They stayed until a nurse came and insisted that Captain Keller needed rest. As they filed out, Reeves paused at the door. "Ma'am," she said, "what you did on that mountain, coming back from the dead, saving us all, that's what legends are made of." "I'm not a legend," Grace said. "I'm just a soldier who was too stubborn to die." After they left, Grace lay in the white silence and thought about legends and truth in the stories that soldiers tell. She thought about her father, about whom she had heard stories her entire life. Sergeant Keller, who had died heroically in Vietnam, who had saved his squad, who had embodied everything noble about military service. But Grace's mother had told her a different story, a truer story. William Keller had been scared and young and far from home. He had not died heroically. He had died because he was in the wrong place at the wrong time, because war was chaos and bullets did not care about nobility or heroism or any of the things that appeared in citations and commendations. Legends were what the living told themselves to make sense of death. Truth was messier, more painful, less satisfying. Grace had survived not because she was legendary, but because she had been lucky lucky and trained and desperate enough to keep moving when her body wanted to stop. That was the truth. Whether anyone wanted to hear it was another question. The investigators came the next day. Two officers from Army CID, Criminal Investigation Division, with recording equipment and legal pads and the methodical manner of people whose job was to reconstruct events from testimony and evidence. Grace told them everything. The briefing, the insertion, the ambush, Blackwood's betrayal, the fall, the survival, the return. She spoke for 3 hours, walking them through each decision, each action, each moment of the nightmare that had unfolded on that mountain. When she finished, the senior investigator, a lieutenant colonel named Anderson, sat back in his chair and studied her with an expression Grace could not quite read. "Captain Keller," Anderson said, "your testimony is consistent with what we've heard from the rest of your team. We've also recovered Blackwood's equipment and communications records. The evidence clearly shows he had been compromised for at least 8 months, possibly longer. He was responsible for leaking classified information that resulted in the deaths of at least 4 American soldiers and the capture of 2 others." Grace felt cold rage settle in her gut. 6 soldiers total, 6 lives lost because one man had decided personal advancement mattered more than the oath he had sworn. "The investigation will continue," Anderson said, "but I want you to know that you and your team are not under suspicion. What happened on that mountain was betrayal, pure and simple. You did what soldiers are supposed to do. You protected your team and completed the mission despite impossible circumstances." After the investigators left, Grace was alone again with her thoughts. She thought about Blackwood and wondered what had broken inside him. What series of choices had led from West Point graduate to traitor? She thought about the soldiers who had died because of him, about the families who had received flags and condolences and would never know that their loved ones had been betrayed by one of their own. The days blurred together. Physical therapy sessions that left Grace sweating and exhausted. Visits from Katie and Margaret, from the team, from General Carmichael, who came personally to tell Grace that she was being recommended for the Distinguished Service Cross and that the Army owed her a debt it could never fully repay. Grace told him she did not want a medal. She wanted to go home to her daughter. Carmichael said she would have both. 3 weeks after the mountain, Grace was transferred from the hospital in Germany to Walter Reed in Washington. The media had gotten hold of the story by then. Not the classified details, but enough to create headlines. Decorated Ranger Captain survives betrayal in 70-foot fall. The snow ghost returns from the dead. Woman warrior saves team after being left for dead. Grace refused all interview requests. She was not interested in being a symbol or a story. She was interested in healing and going home and keeping the promise she had made to Katie. Katie and Margaret came to Walter Reed. They stayed in military lodging nearby so they could visit every day. Katie helped with physical therapy, encouraging her mother through exercises that were painful and frustrating and necessary. Margaret cooked meals that tasted like home and brought them in containers the hospital staff pretended not to notice. Slowly, painfully, Grace's body began to heal. The broken ribs knitted back together. The separated shoulder regained range of motion. The gunshot wound to her leg left a scar, but full function returned. The doctors said she had been lucky. Grace said she had been determined. The doctors did not argue. 6 weeks after the mountain, Grace was released from Walter Reed with instructions for continued outpatient therapy and a bottle of pain medication she would need for at least another month. She walked out of the hospital on her own power, still limping but walking, still in pain but functional. Katie held one hand, Margaret the other, and for the first time in 3 years, Grace felt like maybe, possibly, she was finally going home for real. They drove to Margaret's house in North Carolina, the house where Grace had grown up, where her father's flag sat in a display case in the living room, where photographs of 3 generations of Kellers in uniform lined the walls. Grace looked at those photographs with new eyes now. Her grandfather in World War II, her father in Vietnam, herself in Iraq and Afghanistan. 3 generations who had served, who had sacrificed, who had kept their promises even when those promises cost them everything. But Katie would not be the 4th. Katie would not wear a uniform, would not learn to shoot at 2,000 meters, would not make promises to dying men on foreign soil. Katie would be free to choose her own path. And if Grace had accomplished nothing else in 22 years of service, that freedom was enough. Spring came to North Carolina. Grace continued physical therapy, pushing her body to recover strength and flexibility that combat and injury had stolen. She spent mornings working through exercises, afternoons helping Katie with homework, evenings sitting with Margaret on the porch watching the sun go down over pine trees that had been here long before the wars and would be here long after. In April, General Carmichael called. There would be a ceremony at Fort Bragg. Grace would receive the Distinguished Service Cross. Her team would receive various commendations. Major Ryan Blackwood would receive a military funeral with honors because, despite his betrayal, he had died saving a soldier's life, and military tradition held that redemption in death counted for something. Grace did not want to go, did not want to stand in dress uniform and accept a medal for surviving what should never have happened, did not want to watch Blackwood be buried with honors when 6 other soldiers had died because of his betrayal. But General Carmichael asked personally, and Grace had spent 22 years understanding that some things were bigger than personal preference. The ceremony was held on a clear May morning. The parade ground at Fort Bragg was filled with soldiers in dress uniforms, flags snapping in the breeze. The regiment assembled to honor its own. Grace stood with her team, Martinez on her right, Briggs on her left, despite the prosthetic leg that had replaced the one he lost to infection after the mountain. Reeves was there, Chen was there, the pilots were there. 6 soldiers who had survived when they should have died. General Carmichael read the citation. For extraordinary heroism in action against enemy forces, Captain Grace Keller displayed unparalleled courage, tactical brilliance, and selfless devotion to her fellow soldiers. Despite grievous injuries sustained through betrayal, she single-handedly disrupted enemy operations, exposed a traitor, and led her team to survival against overwhelming odds. Her actions exemplify the highest traditions of military service and reflect great credit upon herself, the 75th Ranger Regiment, and the United States Army. He pinned the medal to Grace's uniform, saluted, shook her hand. The regiment gave the slow hand clap that Rangers reserve for their most respected warriors. Grace stood at attention and felt the weight of history, of tradition, of 22 years in service, of something larger than herself. When the ceremony concluded, when the speeches were finished and the photographs taken, Grace walked to a different part of Fort Bragg, the Regimental Museum, where artifacts of Ranger history were preserved and displayed. She had an appointment. The museum curator, a retired sergeant major named Wilson, met her at the entrance. He led her through halls lined with equipment and photographs and stories from 70 years of Ranger operations. At the back of the museum, in a place of honor, was a new display. A rifle case, sealed and mounted. Inside was the Barrett M82 that had belonged to Colonel James Hartley, that Grace had carried through 3 wars, that had been lost on a mountain in the Caucasus and recovered weeks later by a team that had gone back specifically to find it. The rifle had been restored, cleaned, preserved. The cracked stock had been repaired. The shattered scope had been replaced. The engraving on the stock was still visible. Steady hand, clear eye, true heart. Below the rifle was a plaque. Captain Grace Keller, the Ghost. 37 confirmed kills, 22 years service, Distinguished Service Cross. She kept her promises. Grace stood before the display for a long time. She thought about Hartley bleeding out in her arms, about the promise she had made, about the mission she had finished at nearly the cost of her own life. She thought about all the promises that soldiers made and kept and paid for in ways that never showed up in citations or commendations. "Ma'am," a voice said behind her. Grace turned to find Reeves standing there, also in dress uniform, also wearing new insignia. Captain's bars where Staff Sergeant stripes had been. "Congratulations, Captain Reeves," Grace said. "Thank you, ma'am." Reeves looked at the rifle, at the plaque, at the physical embodiment of legacy passing from one generation to the next. "I wanted to ask you something about training, about what comes next. What do you want to know? How do I do what you did? How do I become someone soldiers trust enough to follow into hell?" Grace thought about the question. She thought about 22 years of learning how to lead, how to make decisions when the stakes were measured in lives, how to carry the weight of command without being crushed by it. "You already know how," Grace said. "You shot Blackwood when he was about to murder Martinez. You made the hard choice in the moment it needed to be made. That's what leadership is. Not rank or medals or speeches. It's making the hard choice when it matters." Reeves nodded slowly. I keep thinking about him, about Blackwood, about how he died saving Chen, trying to understand how someone who betrayed us could also save one of us. People are complicated, Grace said. Blackwood made terrible choices. He got soldiers killed. But in his last moment, he chose to be something better than what he had been. I don't know if that redeems him. I don't know if one good act can balance against all the harm he caused. But it means something, and it has to mean something, or we're all just machines following programs with no chance for change. They stood together looking at the rifle, two soldiers thinking about the cost of service and the meaning of sacrifice, and the promises that bound them to something larger than themselves. That evening, Grace sat with Katie on the porch of Margaret's house. The sky was turning gold and red as the sun dropped toward the horizon. Crickets were beginning their evening chorus. The air smelled of pine and honeysuckle and the particular sweetness of a North Carolina spring. Mom, Katie said, can I ask you something? Anything, baby. Was it worth it? All those years away, all the missions, all the danger. Was it worth what it cost? Grace thought about the question. She thought about her father, about Hartley, about Blackwood and the 6 soldiers who had died because of him. She thought about 22 years of service and sacrifice and the accumulated weight of choices that could not be unmade. Ask me again in 20 years, Grace said, when you're old enough to understand what I was fighting for. What were you fighting for? Grace put her arm around her daughter's shoulders, pulled her close. You, baby. I was fighting so you could sit on this porch on a spring evening and not be afraid. I was fighting so you could choose your own path instead of having it chosen for you by people who wanted to take away your freedom. I was fighting so the world would be a little bit safer, a little bit better, for you and everyone like you. Did you win? Grace smiled. I don't know if anyone ever really wins, but we didn't lose. And sometimes that's enough. They sat together as the sun disappeared and stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Grace thought about all the promises she had made and kept. She thought about Hartley's last words and her father's sacrifice and the long line of Kellers who had served and bled and died for something they believed was worth the cost. She thought about Katie, who would not have to make those choices, who would be free to live without the weight of 3 generations of military service pressing down on her shoulders. And Grace decided that yes, maybe, possibly, it had been worth it after all. 2 months later, Grace Keller officially retired from the United States Army. There was a small ceremony, just her team and a few close friends, nothing like the formal proceedings that had marked her receipt of the Distinguished Service Cross. She turned in her equipment, signed her paperwork, and walked out of Fort Bragg for the last time as a civilian. Katie was waiting in the parking lot. She had her driver's permit now, was learning to drive, was growing up so fast it made Grace's heart ache. They climbed into the car together, and Katie started the engine with the careful concentration of a new driver. Where to? Katie asked. Home, Grace said. We're going home. They drove through North Carolina spring, windows down, radio playing songs that Katie loved and Grace pretended to understand. They drove past Fort Bragg's gates, past the place where Grace had spent 6 years, past the parade ground where she had stood at attention so many times, past the museum where her rifle now rested in a place of honor. They drove toward Margaret's house, toward the life that waited for Grace beyond the uniform, beyond the wars, beyond the promises she had kept at such great cost. Katie was singing along to the radio, happy and young and free. Grace watched her daughter and thought about legacy, about the things we pass down to the next generation. She had passed down courage, determination, the knowledge that some things were worth fighting for. But she had also passed down the freedom to choose, the liberty to be something other than a soldier, the gift of a life lived without war. 3 generations of Kellers had served, 3 generations had sacrificed, but Katie would be different. Katie would be the first to grow up in peace, to choose her own path, to live free from the weight of military tradition. And if that was all Grace had accomplished in 22 years of service, it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. They pulled into the driveway. Margaret was on the porch, waving, smiling, waiting to welcome her daughter home. Grace climbed out of the car and stood for a moment looking at the house, at her mother, at Katie running ahead to tell her grandmother about the drive. Above the porch, an American flag waved in the breeze, the same flag that had hung there when Grace was a child, when her father was fighting and dying in Vietnam, the same flag that represented everything 3 generations of Kellers had fought to protect. Grace saluted the flag one last time. Then she walked into the house, into the future, into the life she had earned through sacrifice and survival, and the simple, stubborn refusal to break her promises. The door closed behind her. Inside were laughter and family and the smell of dinner cooking. Inside was home, real and solid and waiting. Outside, the flag continued to wave. The sun continued to set. The world continued to turn. And somewhere, in a museum at Fort Bragg, a rifle rested in its case with an engraving that read, "Steady hand, clear eye, true heart." The ghost had come home. The mission was complete. The promises were kept. And Grace Keller, for the first time in 22 years, was finally, truly at peace. 6 months after the mountain, Grace Keller stood at the edge of a firing range at Fort Bragg, watching 40 young soldiers attempt to hit targets at 800 meters. Most of them were missing. The wind was gusting at 12 knots from the northwest. Temperature was dropping as afternoon gave way to evening. And not one of these kids, these 20-year-olds who thought they understood what combat meant, had properly calculated for the conditions. Grace said nothing. She stood with her arms crossed, Barrett M82 slung over her shoulder, and watched them fail. This was the 5th week of the advanced sniper course she had been teaching since accepting the position as lead instructor 3 months ago. These 40 had started as 60, 20 had already washed out, unable to handle the physical demands or the mental discipline required to become snipers. The 40 who remained thought they were good. Grace knew they were mediocre at best. She was 43 years old now. Her body had healed from the mountain as much as it ever would. She walked with a slight limp that became pronounced when rain was coming. Her left shoulder ached on cold mornings. The scars on her ribs pulled tight when she stretched. But she could still shoot, could still read wind and distance and a dozen other variables, could still place a bullet exactly where she wanted it at ranges that made these kids shake their heads in disbelief. Teaching was supposed to be easier than combat. That was what everyone had told her. "You've earned your rest," they said. "Time to pass on what you know," they said. "Let someone else do the bleeding," they said. They were wrong. Teaching was harder than combat in ways Grace had not anticipated. In combat, you made decisions that affected your immediate team, the soldiers you could see and touch and protect with your own actions. In teaching, you made decisions that affected soldiers you would never meet, would never serve beside. Soldiers who would take what you taught them into future wars and either survive because you prepared them well or die because you failed to give them what they needed. The weight of that responsibility pressed down on Grace's shoulders with a force that made combat seem simple by comparison. "Cease fire," Grace called out. The shooting stopped. "Make your rifle safe and fall in." The 40 soldiers secured their weapons and assembled in formation. Grace walked down the line studying faces. Some showed frustration at their failures. Some showed arrogance, convinced they were better than their results indicated. A few showed the quiet determination that marked soldiers who understood they had more to learn. Grace stopped in front of a young corporal named Jackson. He was 22 years old, Alabama-born, with the lean build of a distance runner and eyes that carried more intelligence than his good old boy accent suggested. "Corporal Jackson," Grace said, "what was your hit percentage today?" 3 out of 10, ma'am." Jackson's voice was steady. No excuses, just facts. "Why?" "Wind calculation was off. I didn't properly account for the crosswind component at that distance." Grace nodded. At 800 meters, a 12-knot crosswind moves your bullet approximately 3 feet. You need to compensate by aiming into the wind. But it's not just wind. What else affects the shot? "Temperature," Jackson said, "barometric pressure, humidity, altitude, the spin drift of the bullet, the Coriolis effect at extreme ranges." "All correct." Grace turned to address the entire formation. "Every one of you missed more shots today than you made. Some of you are thinking this is about the rifle or the conditions or bad luck. You're wrong. It's about you. It's about whether you have the discipline to slow down, to think, to calculate before you shoot. Because in combat, you don't get second chances. You miss and someone dies. Maybe one of your team, maybe you." She paused, letting the words settle. These kids needed to understand that sniping was not about being a good shot. It was about being a thinker, a mathematician, someone who could process complex variables under stress and make the right decision in the second before the trigger was squeezed. "Tomorrow we're doing this again." Grace said. 800 meters, same conditions. I expect every one of you to improve your hit percentage by at least 50%. If you can't, you need to think seriously about whether this is the right specialty for you. Dismissed. The formation broke. Soldiers headed toward the barracks, talking among themselves, some defending their performance, others quiet with the introspection that came from recognizing failure. Grace watched them go and thought about the soldiers she had trained, about the ones who had gone on to combat and come home, about the ones who had not. Captain Keller, a voice said behind her. Grace turned to find Staff Sergeant Anna Reeves approaching. Reeves had been promoted to captain 6 months ago, but had requested a demotion back to Staff Sergeant so she could stay in operational roles rather than move into command positions. Grace had understood not everyone was meant to lead. Some were meant to do, to execute, to be the tip of the spear rather than the hand that guided it. Anna, Grace said, what brings you to my range? Reeves held out a file folder. Orders came through. I'm being assigned to Delta. They need a sniper team leader for operations in the Middle East. Grace took the folder, scanned the orders. Delta Force, Special Operations, classified missions in countries that officially did not have American boots on the ground. It was prestigious, dangerous, exactly the kind of assignment that soldiers like Reeves lived for. Congratulations, Grace said. You've earned it. Reeves nodded, but her expression was troubled. I wanted to ask you something before I ship out, about the mountain, about what happened with Blackwood. Grace felt something tighten in her chest. She did not talk about the mountain if she could avoid it. The nightmares had faded, but they had not disappeared. Some nights she still woke gasping, feeling the sensation of falling, feeling the cold that had tried to kill her. What about it? Grace asked carefully. How did you know? Reeves asked. How did you know Blackwood was dirty before he pushed you? Grace thought back to that night, to the moments before the betrayal. I didn't know for certain, but I saw something in his eyes, a calculation, like he was weighing options that had nothing to do with the mission and everything to do with something else. I'd seen that look before in soldiers who were about to make bad choices. But you didn't report him. You didn't pull the team out. I didn't have proof, Grace said. Just a feeling. And you can't act on feelings when it comes to accusing a superior officer of being a traitor. I thought maybe I was wrong. Thought maybe I was seeing threats that weren't there. But you weren't wrong. No, Grace said quietly. I wasn't wrong. And soldiers died because I didn't trust my instincts enough to act on them. Reeves was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I'm going to be leading soldiers into combat, making decisions that will determine whether they live or die. How do I know when to trust my instincts? How do I know I'm not just paranoid or scared or seeing threats that aren't real? Grace looked at the younger woman and saw herself 20 years ago, saw the same questions, the same fears, the same desperate need to know that the decisions she made would be the right ones. You don't know, Grace said. That's the truth no one wants to hear. You make the best decision you can with the information you have, and then you live with the consequences. Sometimes you're right and you save lives. Sometimes you're wrong and people die. The weight of command is carrying both possibilities and not letting them paralyze you. How do you carry it? How do you live with the ones you got wrong? Grace thought about Blackwood, about the 6 soldiers who had died because of intelligence he sold, about the team members who had been wounded on that mountain because Grace had not acted on her suspicions soon enough. You remember them, Grace said. You honor them by trying to do better next time, and you understand that perfect decisions don't exist. Only decisions made in imperfect circumstances by imperfect people doing their best. Reeves nodded slowly. Thank you, ma'am, for training me, for showing me what it means to be a soldier. Just come home alive, Grace said. That's all the thanks I need. After Reeves left, Grace stood alone on the range as the sun dropped toward the horizon. She thought about all the soldiers she had trained, all the young men and women who had passed through her courses and gone on to combat. Some had become legends in their own right. Some had come home wounded or broken. Some had not come home at all. Each one carried a piece of Grace with them. Each one represented a choice she had made about what to teach, what to emphasize, what warnings to give. The responsibility of that was crushing in ways that made combat seem straightforward by comparison. Grace picked up her rifle and walked to the 800-meter line. She settled into a prone position, controlled her breathing, found the target in her scope. The wind was still gusting, the light was fading, conditions were poor for accurate shooting. She calculated wind speed, temperature, distance. She accounted for the spin drift of the bullet, for the slight cant in her rifle, for the way fading light affected depth perception. Then she exhaled halfway and squeezed the trigger. The Barrett roared. 800 meters downrange, the target showed a hole dead center. Grace fired 9 more times, 9 more holes, each within an inch of the first. 10 for 10, perfect score under conditions that had defeated 40 younger soldiers. She cleared her rifle and stood. Her shoulder ached from the recoil. Her ribs pulled tight where the scars were. Her leg throbbed where the bullet had found her on that mountain. But she could still shoot, could still perform when it mattered, could still show these kids what perfect looked like, even if they could not yet achieve it themselves. Grace walked back toward the instructor building as darkness settled over Fort Bragg. She was thinking about Katie, about the daughter who was now 15 and pulling away in the way teenagers do, establishing independence, testing boundaries, becoming her own person. She was thinking about Margaret, about the mother who had raised her alone after Vietnam took her husband, who had buried one Keller and watched another walk the same path. She was thinking about legacy and what it meant to pass something down to the next generation. Not just skills or knowledge, but values, principles, the understanding that some things were worth fighting for even when the cost was high. That night, Grace sat at her desk in her small apartment off base and wrote letters. She wrote to the families of soldiers she had trained who had been killed in action. She wrote words that felt inadequate, hollow, unable to capture the complexity of grief and sacrifice and the terrible mathematics of war. But she wrote them anyway because it was her duty, because these families deserved to know that their sons and daughters had been trained by someone who cared, who remembered, who carried their names forward. The letters piled up. Grace had written 47 of them over the past 3 months. 47 soldiers she had trained who had died in combat. Some had died because they made mistakes. Some had died because war was chaos and bullets did not care about training or preparation or how much their instructor had tried to prepare them. Each letter was a reminder of the weight Grace carried, the responsibility that came with being a teacher, the knowledge that her decisions in a classroom or on a range would echo forward into combat situations she could not control or predict. She finished the last letter and sat in the quiet of her apartment thinking about Hartley. Colonel James Hartley, who had trained her, who had taught her everything she knew about sniping and soldiering and what it meant to serve. He had died 13 years ago in Afghanistan, and Grace had kept the promise she made to him at the cost of nearly her own life. But what promise was she making now? What legacy was she leaving? Was she preparing soldiers for combat, or was she just teaching them how to die in more distant and precise ways? The questions haunted Grace in the darkness of her apartment. She had no answers. She suspected Hartley had not had answers either. He had just done his best and hoped it was enough and carried the weight of responsibility until it killed him. The next morning, Grace returned to the range. The 40 soldiers assembled before dawn, breath visible in the cold air, rifles cleaned and ready. Grace walked down the line studying faces, looking for the ones who had taken yesterday's failure seriously, who had spent the evening studying wind tables and ballistic charts, who understood that improvement required more than just showing up. She stopped in front of Jackson again. The young corporal met her eyes with steady confidence. "Did you study last night, Corporal?" Grace asked. "Yes, ma'am. Reviewed wind calculation tables, practiced dry firing to improve trigger control, visualized the shot sequence." "Good." Grace moved to the next soldier, a private named Chen. No relation to David Chen from her team, but the name always made Grace think of the mountains, of the specialist who had been wounded twice and kept fighting. "Private Chen, what did you learn from yesterday?" "That I need to slow down, ma'am." Chen's voice was quiet but firm. "I was rushing the shot, trying to prove I was fast instead of proving I was accurate." "Speed is the enemy of precision," Grace said. "In combat, you'll have seconds to make the shot, but those seconds need to be used for thinking, not just pulling the trigger. Remember that." She addressed the entire formation. "Today we shoot again, 800 meters. Same conditions. I expect every one of you to improve. Not because I'm demanding it, but because your future teammates are depending on it. Every shot you miss in training is a shot you might miss in combat. Every shot you miss in combat might be a teammate who dies because you weren't good enough." The words were harsh but necessary. These soldiers needed to understand that training was not about passing a course or earning a qualification. It was about being ready for the moment when everything would depend on making the right decision under pressure. The day passed in cycles of shooting and correction, of Grace watching through spotting scopes and calling out adjustments, of soldiers slowly, painfully, improving their performance through repetition and discipline. By the end of the day, hit percentages had improved across the board. Jackson went from 3 out of 10 to 7 out of 10. Chen went from 2 out of 10 to 6 out of 10. Progress, not perfection, but progress. Grace would take it. That evening, she received a call from General Carmichael. There was a situation developing overseas. Intelligence suggested a high-value target would be vulnerable within a specific time window. Delta Force was putting together a team. They needed the best sniper available to provide overwatch for the operation. They wanted Grace. Sir, Grace said carefully, I'm retired from operational duty. I'm an instructor now. I know, Carmichael said. But this is important, Grace. We need someone we can trust absolutely. Someone who won't miss when it matters. That's you. Grace felt the old pull, the sense that she was needed, that she could make a difference, that walking away would mean someone else would have to take the risk. The same pull that had made her accept one more mission when she should have stayed home for Christmas, when she should have kept her promise to Katie. I can't, sir, Grace said. I made a promise to my daughter. No more combat, no more missions. I've given enough. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Carmichael said, I understand. I had to ask, but I understand. We'll find someone else. After the call ended, Grace sat in the darkness of her office and wondered if she had made the right choice. Wondered if the soldier who took that mission in her place would be good enough, skilled enough, prepared enough. Wondered if someone would die because she had chosen to stay home and teach instead of going back into the field one more time. The weight of that choice pressed down on her, but she had made her decision and she would live with it. That was what soldiers did. Make decisions, live with consequences, carry the weight forward. Grace drove home that night to Margaret's house where she and Katie were still living. Katie was in the kitchen doing homework, surrounded by textbooks and papers, working on physics problems with the same focused intensity Grace brought to calculating ballistic trajectories. How was your day? Grace asked, setting down her keys. Fine, Katie said without looking up. How was yours? Taught kids to shoot, same as always. Katie looked up, then studied her mother's face. Something's wrong. Grace poured herself a coffee and sat down across from her daughter. I got offered a mission today. Overseas. Combat operation. I turned it down. Good, Katie said. You promised no more missions. I know. Grace wrapped her hands around the warm mug. But now I'm wondering if I made the right choice. If the soldier who goes instead of me will be good enough. If someone will die because I wasn't there. Katie set down her pencil. Mom, you can't save everyone. You've spent 22 years trying. At some point, you have to let someone else carry the weight. When did you get so wise? Grace asked, smiling slightly. I had a good teacher, Katie said. You taught me that keeping promises matters, that being there for the people who need you matters. I need you here, Mom, not over there getting shot at. Grace reached across the table and took her daughter's hand. You're right. I know you're right. It's just hard to let go. I know, Katie said, but you have to, for you, for me, for everyone. They sat together in the kitchen as evening deepened into night. Grace thought about the soldiers she had trained, about the missions she would never go on, about the weight of responsibility that came with choosing to teach instead of doing. She thought about Hartley and the promise she had kept. She thought about her father and the promises he had made that Vietnam had prevented him from keeping. She thought about 3 generations of Kellers who had served and bled and died. And she thought about Katie, who would not have to make those choices, who would be free to live without the weight of military service pressing down on her shoulders. The weeks passed. Grace continued teaching, continued watching young soldiers slowly improve, continued writing letters to families of the ones who did not come home. She heard through unofficial channels that the mission Carmichael had called about was successful, that the sniper who went in her place had performed well, that no one had died. The relief Grace felt was profound. She had made the right choice. This time she had made the right choice. One afternoon in early fall, Grace was on the range with her students when she noticed a figure standing at the edge of the course. Older man, civilian clothes, walking with the careful deliberation of someone whose body had been broken and put back together. Grace called a break and walked over. As she got closer, she recognized him. Master Sergeant Tom Briggs, retired now, walking on a prosthetic leg that he had received after infection, claimed the one he had damaged on the mountain. "Tom," Grace said warmly, "what brings you here?" Briggs smiled. "Heard you were teaching. Wanted to see how the next generation was shaping up." They walked together along the edge of the range, two soldiers who had survived what should have killed them, who carried the scars and the memories and the weight of everything they had seen. "How are you adjusting?" Grace asked. "To civilian life?" Briggs shrugged. "It's different. Quiet. Sometimes too quiet. I miss it, if I'm being honest. Miss the team. Miss the purpose." "I know what you mean," Grace said. "Teaching helps. Gives me something to do with all this knowledge. But it's not the same as being in it." "Nothing ever will be," Briggs said. "That's what nobody tells you. You spend your whole career preparing for the day you can retire, thinking it will be this great relief. Then you get there and realize you've lost the only thing that gave your life meaning." They watched the students shooting, these young soldiers who did not yet understand what combat really meant, who had not yet lost friends or made impossible choices or carried the weight of command. "You know what I think?" Briggs said. "I think we're doing the most important work now. Training these kids, giving them the skills to survive. We can't protect them from war, but we can prepare them for it. That's worth something." Grace nodded. It had to be worth something. Otherwise, what was the point of all the sacrifice, all the pain, all the accumulated weight of 22 years in service? "You saved my life on that mountain," Briggs said quietly. "I never properly thanked you for that." "You would have done the same for me," Grace said. "Maybe." Briggs looked at his prosthetic leg. "But you're the one who actually did it. You crawled back from the dead and saved us all. That's something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life." "We all saved each other," Grace said. "That's what teams do." After Briggs left, Grace returned to her students. She put them through drills that tested not just their shooting, but their decision-making, their ability to stay calm under pressure, their understanding that combat was not about individual heroics, but about teamwork and discipline and making the right choice in the second that mattered. She taught them about wind and distance and temperature. She taught them about patience and calculation and the importance of knowing when not to shoot. She taught them everything Hartley had taught her, everything she had learned through 2 decades of combat, everything that might keep them alive when the shooting started. And she hoped it was enough. She prayed it was enough, because that was all any teacher could do: prepare students as best they could, and then hope they had given them what they needed to survive. That evening, Grace sat on Margaret's porch, watching the sun set through pine trees that had been here long before the wars and would be here long after. Katie sat beside her, no longer needing to be close, but choosing to be anyway, understanding that these quiet moments with her mother were precious and finite. "Mom," Katie said, "can I ask you something?" "Always." "Do you regret it?" 22 years in the Army. Everything you gave up, everything it cost." Grace thought about the question. She thought about Hartley dying in her arms. She thought about the mountain and the cold and the certainty that she was going to die. She thought about the letters she wrote to families of soldiers who had not come home. She thought about Katie sitting beside her, free to choose her own path, free to live without war pressing down on her shoulders. "No," Grace said, "I don't regret it. It was hard. It cost more than I wanted to pay. But it mattered. And knowing that it mattered makes the cost bearable." Katie leaned her head against her mother's shoulder. "I'm glad you came home." "Me too, baby, me too." They sat together as darkness settled over North Carolina. Inside the house, Margaret was cooking dinner. The smell of roasting chicken drifted through the screen door. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. The world turned on its axis, indifferent to the stories of soldiers and the weight they carried. But Grace was home. She was teaching the next generation. She was keeping her promises. And for now, for this moment, that was enough. The rifle in the museum at Fort Bragg still bore Hartley's engraving: "Steady hand, clear eye, true heart." Grace carried those words with her every day, into the classroom, onto the range, into the quiet moments when she wondered if what she was doing mattered. She was no longer Ghost, the legendary sniper who appeared where enemies thought no one could go. She was Captain Keller, the instructor who taught young soldiers how to survive. The work was different, but the purpose was the same: protect the team, complete the mission, come home alive. And every day, Grace honored the promises she had made. To Hartley, to her father, to Katie, to every soldier who had trusted her with their training and their lives. Steady hand, clear eye, true heart. The mission continued. The work went on. The legacy passed forward. And Grace Keller, teacher and soldier and keeper of promises, carried it all with the quiet strength of someone who had survived the impossible and refused to let it break her. The sun disappeared below the horizon. Stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Grace and Katie went inside to dinner, to family, to the life that had been earned through sacrifice and survival. Outside, the flag above the porch continued to wave in the evening breeze, a reminder of everything 3 generations of Kellers had fought to protect. And in a classroom at Fort Bragg, 40 young soldiers would return tomorrow to learn, to train, to prepare for wars that waited in their futures. Grace would be there to teach them. That was her mission now. That was her promise. And she would keep it, the way she had kept all the others, no matter what it cost. Because that was what soldiers did. They kept their promises. They honored their duty. They carried the weight forward. And they taught the next generation to do the same. 2 years after the mountain, on a morning when spring was giving way to summer and the air at Fort Bragg carried the scent of pine and cut grass, Grace Keller received a phone call that brought her past crashing into her present with the force of an avalanche. The voice on the other end belonged to Sergeant First Class David Torres, one of the soldiers she had trained 18 months ago, a kid from Texas with steady hands and the kind of quiet determination that marked good snipers. He was calling from a military hospital in Germany, and his voice carried the hollow quality of a man who had seen something that would stay with him forever. "Ma'am," Torres said, "I need to tell you something about Jackson." Grace felt her chest tighten. Corporal Jackson, the Alabama boy with the intelligent eyes, the one who had gone from 3 out of 10 to 7 out of 10, who had shown such promise, such dedication. She had recommended him for operational deployment 6 months ago. He had written her a letter thanking her for the training, telling her he would make her proud. "What happened?" Grace asked, though she already knew from Torres's tone that whatever had happened was not good. "We were in Syria," Torres said. "Overwatch position for a compound raid. Jackson had the shot. 800 meters, crosswind, high-stress situation. He calculated wrong. The bullet missed. The target escaped and killed 3 Marines before we could neutralize him." Grace closed her eyes. She could see it in her mind, the scope, the target, the moment when Jackson squeezed the trigger, thinking he had done everything right. The terrible realization when the shot went wide. "Is Jackson alive?" Grace asked. "Physically, yes, ma'am." Torres paused. "But he's not doing well. He blames himself for those Marines. He's saying he wasn't trained well enough, that he failed, that those deaths are on him. He asked me to call you. He needs to hear from someone who understands." "Give me the hospital information," Grace said. "I'll be there tomorrow." She hung up and sat in her office at Fort Bragg, staring at the wall where commendations and certificates hung, where photographs of her classes lined the shelves, where 47 letters to families of fallen students sat in a file cabinet as a reminder of the weight she carried. Jackson's failure was her failure. She had trained him. She had certified him as ready for operational deployment. She had sent him into combat with skills that had not been as sufficient when it mattered most. 3 Marines were dead, and Grace could not escape the knowledge that their blood was partially on her hands. That evening, she told Katie she would be traveling to Germany, that one of her students needed her, that it might take a few days. Katie was 16 now, growing into a young woman with her mother's eyes and her grandmother's strength. She studied Grace's face and understood without being told that this was about more than just a routine visit. "Mom," Katie said carefully, "you can't save everyone, remember?" "I know," Grace replied, "but I have to try. I trained him. I told him he was ready. If he wasn't, that's on me." Katie was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that made Grace realize her daughter had grown wiser than she had any right to be at 16. "You taught him everything you could. What he did with that training, how he performed under pressure, that's on him. You gave him the tools. He's the one who had to use them." Grace wanted to believe that, wanted to accept that she had done her job, and Jackson's failure was his own responsibility. But she could not shake the image of 3 Marines dying because a shot had missed, because training had not been sufficient, because somewhere in the process Grace had failed to prepare a soldier for the reality of combat. The flight to Germany was long, and Grace spent it thinking about all the soldiers she had trained, about the ones who had performed well and the ones who had not, about the terrible mathematics of teaching when every failure could be measured in lives lost. She thought about Hartley and wondered if he had felt this same weight, this same crushing responsibility when soldiers he trained made mistakes in combat. She thought about her father, dead at 23 in Vietnam, and wondered if the soldiers who had trained him had felt responsible for his death, or if they had simply accepted that war was chaos and training could only do so much to prepare young men for the reality of bullets and blood. The hospital in Germany was the same one where Grace had recovered after the mountain. Walking through the corridors brought memories flooding back. The pain, the surgeries, the slow climb back to functionality. She found Torres waiting outside Jackson's room, looking older than 25, wearing the weight of combat in the lines around his eyes. "Ma'am," Torres said, standing to attention. "At ease, Sergeant." Grace studied his face. "How are you holding up?" "I've been better, ma'am." Torres gestured toward Jackson's room. "He's in bad shape, blames himself for everything. Won't talk to the chaplain, won't talk to the psychologist. Just sits there replaying that shot in his mind." Grace nodded. She had been there herself, replaying missions and decisions and moments when things had gone wrong despite every effort to make them go right. The weight of failure in combat was something that could crush a soldier if they let it. "Let me talk to him," Grace said. She entered the room alone. Jackson sat in a chair by the window, staring out at the German countryside without seeing it. He was 24 years old but looked 50, carrying a weight that aged him beyond his years. When he heard the door open, he turned and his face crumpled when he saw Grace. "Ma'am," he said, voice breaking. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Grace pulled a chair close and sat facing him. "Tell me what happened." Jackson described his mission in painful detail. The compound, the target, the setup on Overwatch, the calculations he had made for wind and distance and temperature. The moment when he had squeezed the trigger, confident he had done everything right. The terrible realization when the target did not drop, when instead the man disappeared into the compound and emerged minutes later with an automatic weapon, killing 3 Marines before being neutralized. "I calculated it perfectly," Jackson said, tears streaming down his face. "I did everything you taught me. Wind speed, temperature, distance, bullet drop, everything. But I still missed. Those Marines died because I wasn't good enough." Grace let him finish, let him pour out all the guilt and pain and self-recrimination. Then she spoke with the quiet authority of someone who had spent 22 years making life and death decisions. "You want to know something, Jackson? I've missed shots. Important shots. Shots where lives depended on me being perfect. I've made mistakes that got people hurt. And every single one of those failures sits with me, weighs on me, reminds me that I'm human and humans are fallible." "But ma'am," Jackson protested, "you're ghost. You're legendary. You don't miss." Grace almost laughed. The legend and the reality were so far apart. Legends were what people told themselves to make sense of chaos. Reality was messier, more painful, less satisfying. "I missed a shot in Fallujah that let an insurgent escape who later killed 2 soldiers in an ambush. I missed a shot in Afghanistan that cost a SEAL team their element of surprise and got one of them wounded. I've missed dozens of shots over 22 years. The difference between me and you is that I've learned to carry the weight without letting it destroy me." "How?" Jackson asked desperately. "How do you live with it?" Grace thought about Hartley, about the promise she had made, about the mountain and the cold, and the absolute certainty that she was going to die. She thought about Katie waiting at home, about Margaret who had buried a husband and watched a daughter walk the same path, about 3 generations of Kellers who had served and bled and carried the weight. "You remember the ones you failed," she said. "You honor them by trying to do better next time, and you understand that perfection doesn't exist. You made the best decision you could with the information you had. The target was 800 meters away in a combat situation with lives on the line. You calculated, you aimed, you fired. The shot missed. That happens. It's happened to every sniper who ever lived." "But 3 Marines died," Jackson said. "Yes," Grace said quietly. 3 Marines died, and you will carry that with you for the rest of your life. But those deaths are not solely on you. They're on the target who chose to fight. They're on the chaos of combat. They're on 100 factors beyond your control. You did your job the best you could. Sometimes that's not enough. That's the reality of war." Jackson was silent for a long time. Then he said, "I don't know if I can go back. If I can pick up a rifle again and trust myself to make the shot." "You don't have to decide that today," Grace said. "Take time. Heal. Process what happened. But understand this, you are a good soldier. You have the skills and the discipline and the dedication. One missed shot doesn't erase that. It just means you're human. They talked for 2 more hours. Grace shared stories of her own failures, of shots missed and decisions made wrong, of the accumulated weight of 22 years in combat. She talked about Hartley and the promise she had kept, about the mountain and the moment when she had wanted to give up, but had kept moving anyway. She talked about Katie and the promise to be home, about the choice to become a teacher instead of continuing to deploy, about finding new purpose after combat. And slowly, painfully, Jackson began to understand that failure was not the end, that carrying the weight was part of being a soldier, that the measure of a man was not whether he failed, but whether he stood back up afterward. When Grace left the hospital that evening, Torres was still waiting. He looked at her with a question in his eyes. "Will he be okay?" Torres asked. Eventually, Grace said, "It takes time, but he's strong. He'll find his way through this. Thank you for coming. Ma'am, it means more than you know." Grace flew back to North Carolina thinking about Jackson and Torres and all the young soldiers carrying weights they barely understood. She thought about the responsibility of teaching, of sending soldiers into combat knowing some would fail, some would be wounded, some would die. The weight of that was crushing, but it was necessary. Someone had to train the next generation. Someone had to pass on the knowledge and the skills and the understanding that war was hell, but some things were worth fighting for anyway. When she returned home, Katie was waiting with news that made Grace's heart swell with pride and fear in equal measure. Katie had received her acceptance letter to MIT. Full scholarship. She would be studying engineering, following her passion for understanding how things worked, building instead of destroying. "That's wonderful, baby," Grace said, pulling her daughter into a hug. "I'm so proud of you." Katie pulled back, studied her mother's face. "How was your trip? How's your student?" "He'll survive," Grace said. "He's carrying weight he doesn't know how to handle yet. But he'll learn." "Like you did," Katie said. "Like I did." That summer, Grace watched Katie prepare for college, watched her daughter pack up books and clothes and the red and green scarf that had survived the mountain. Katie insisted on taking it, said it reminded her that her mother was strong enough to survive anything, that Kellers kept their promises no matter what it cost. In August, Grace drove Katie to MIT. They made the trip in 2 days, stopping at hotels, talking about everything and nothing, mother and daughter having the kind of conversations that would become memories when distance separated them. At MIT, Grace helped Katie move into her dormitory, met her roommate, gave her the kind of advice that mothers give daughters when they leave home. "Be smart," Grace said. "Be safe. Call your grandmother and me every week." "I will, Mom." Katie hugged her mother tightly. "Thank you for everything. For serving, for coming home, for teaching me what it means to keep promises." Grace drove back to North Carolina alone, the car feeling empty without Katie's presence. She was proud of her daughter, proud that Katie was free to pursue her dreams without the weight of military service pressing down on her shoulders. But she also felt the loss, the absence, the knowledge that the girl she had raised was now a woman forging her own path. Back at Fort Bragg, Grace threw herself into teaching with renewed intensity. She trained snipers with the understanding that every lesson might mean the difference between a soldier coming home or not. She wrote letters to families of the fallen with the knowledge that words could not heal, but they could honor. She carried the weight of responsibility with the quiet strength of someone who understood that this was her purpose now, her mission, her way of keeping the promises she had made. Fall came to North Carolina. Grace received word that Jackson had returned to duty, that he was working as an instructor now instead of an operational sniper, that he was passing on what he had learned to the next generation. Grace felt something in her chest loosen. He had found his way through the darkness. He would survive. In October, Grace received orders to Washington, D.C. The Secretary of Defense wanted to meet with her, wanted to discuss the future of sniper training programs, wanted her input on how to better prepare soldiers for the reality of combat. Grace flew to D.C. and spent 2 days in meetings with officers and civilians who made decisions about training and doctrine and the future of warfare. On the third day, Grace had a morning free. She took a taxi to Arlington National Cemetery, to the place where her father was buried, where 3 generations of Kellers had their final rest. She walked through rows of white headstones until she found his grave. Sergeant William Keller, 1945 to 1968, Vietnam, Bronze Star. Grace knelt beside the grave, running her fingers over the engraved letters. She was 45 years old now, more than twice the age her father had been when he died. She had lived an entire career in the Army, had survived wars that had killed better soldiers, had made it home when, statistically, she should not have. "Hey, Dad," Grace said quietly. "It's been a while. I know we never met. You died before I could know you. But I've spent my whole life trying to understand what you died for. Whether it was worth the mom, whether the sacrifice meant anything." The cemetery was quiet except for wind moving through trees. Grace sat on the grass beside her father's grave and talked to a man she had never known, telling him about Katie and MIT, about the mountain and the promise she had kept, about teaching and the weight of responsibility, and the question that haunted every soldier. Was it worth it? "Mom told me you were scared," Grace said, "that you didn't die heroically, that war wasn't noble or clean or any of the things they put in citations. But you went anyway. You served anyway. You kept your promises even though it cost you everything." She paused, feeling tears on her face. "I think I finally understand. It's not about glory or heroism or being remembered. It's about standing up when it matters, about protecting the people who need protecting, about believing that some things are bigger than your fear or your doubts or your desire to stay safe." Grace looked up at the sky, at clouds moving slowly across blue expanse. "I kept my promises, Dad. To Colonel Hartley, to my team, to Katie. I served for 22 years. I survived what should have killed me. I came home and taught the next generation. And Katie is free. She gets to choose her own path. She doesn't have to be a soldier. That's what we bought with our service, that freedom. And maybe that makes it worth it." She stood, saluted her father's grave with the respect due to a fallen soldier. Then she walked through Arlington, past thousands of white headstones, past the physical manifestation of sacrifice measured across generations, past the accumulated weight of every soldier who had ever believed that something was worth fighting for. Grace found Colonel Hartley's grave 3 rows over. She had not visited in years, but she remembered the location perfectly. She knelt beside his headstone, reading the inscription, "Colonel James Hartley, 1960 to 2011, Afghanistan, Silver Star." "I kept my promise, sir," Grace said. "Finished the mission, whatever it took. Nearly cost me my life, but I kept my word. And now I'm teaching the next generation everything you taught me. Steady hand, clear eye, true heart. They're learning, sir, slowly, but they're learning." She sat beside Hartley's grave and thought about all the lessons he had taught her, all the wisdom he had passed down, all the knowledge that had kept her alive through 2 decades of combat. She thought about Jackson and Torres and Anna Reeves and all the soldiers she had trained, all the young men and women who were carrying forward the legacy that Hartley had started. The sun was setting when Grace finally left Arlington. She took a taxi back to her hotel, thinking about fathers and mentors in the long chain of soldiers who had served and taught and passed the torch forward. She thought about Katie at MIT, free to study engineering, free to build instead of destroy, free to live without the weight of military service pressing down on her shoulders. That evening, Grace called Katie. They talked about classes and roommates and the challenges of higher mathematics. Katie was thriving, was happy, was exactly where she was supposed to be. When they finally said goodbye, Katie's last words were, "Love you, Mom. Thank you for everything." Grace sat in her hotel room and cried. Not from sadness, but from relief, from gratitude, from the overwhelming knowledge that she had done it, had kept her promises, had survived long enough to see her daughter free and happy and safe. The next day, Grace returned to Fort Bragg. She went back to teaching, back to the range, back to watching young soldiers learn the skills that might keep them alive in combat. She wrote letters to families of the fallen and visited students in hospitals and carried the weight of responsibility with the understanding that this was her purpose now. This was how she served. Months passed. Grace received word that Anna Reeves had been killed in action in Syria, that the soldiers she had trained and promoted and sent to Delta Force had died doing the work that only the best could do. Grace wrote a letter to Reeves's family, words that felt inadequate but necessary, honoring a soldier who had been one of the finest snipers Grace had ever known. She added Reeves's name to the list of 48 soldiers she had trained who had not come home. 48 names that she carried forward, 48 reminders of the cost of service, 48 reasons to train the next generation better, smarter, more completely. Winter came to North Carolina. Katie came home for Christmas, the first one they had spent together in years. They decorated the tree in Margaret's house, cooked meals that filled the kitchen with warmth and the smell of family, sat on the porch bundled in coats, watching snow fall on pine trees. On Christmas Eve, exactly 3 years after the mountain, Grace and Katie sat together in the living room. Margaret was asleep upstairs. The house was quiet except for the crackle of fire in the fireplace and the soft tick of the clock on the mantel. "Mom," Katie said, "can I ask you the question one more time?" Grace knew what question she meant. The question Katie had asked before. "Was it worth it?" "Yes," Grace said. "Ask me. Was it worth it? All the sacrifice, all the pain, all the years away from family. Was it worth what it cost?" Grace thought about her father, about Hartley, about Blackwood and the 6 soldiers who had died because of his betrayal. She thought about the mountain and the pond and the absolute certainty that she was going to die. She thought about Anna Reeves and the 47 other students who had not come home. She thought about Jackson carrying the weight of 3 dead Marines. She thought about 3 generations of Kellers who had served and bled and died for something they believed was bigger than themselves. She thought about Katie sitting beside her, free to study engineering at MIT, free to choose her own path, free to live in a world that was safer because soldiers had stood between the darkness and the light. "Yes," Grace said finally, "it was worth it. Not because the wars were just or the politics were right or because we won some grand victory, but because it mattered, because standing up matters, because protecting people who need protecting matters, because keeping promises matters, and because you get to be free. That makes it all worth it." Katie leaned her head against her mother's shoulder. "I'm proud of you, Mom, for serving, for surviving, for teaching me what it means to keep your word." They sat together as the fire burned down to embers. Outside, snow continued to fall on North Carolina, covering the world in white, erasing the marks of the day and starting fresh. Grace thought about the future, about the soldiers she would train, about the lessons she would pass forward, about the legacy that stretched from her father through her to Katie and beyond. The clock struck midnight. Christmas Day. 3 years since the mountain. 3 years since Grace Keller had fallen 70 feet through a blizzard and survived against all probability. 3 years since she had kept a promise to a dying man and saved her team and exposed a traitor. 3 years of healing and teaching and learning to live with the weight of service. Grace stood, walked to the window, looked out at the snow-covered yard. The flag above the porch hung still in the windless night. 3 generations of Kellers had served under that flag. 3 generations had sacrificed. But Katie would be different. Katie would be free. And that freedom, that choice, that liberty to live without war pressing down on her shoulders, that was what Grace had fought for. That was what her father had died for. That was what Hartley had made her promise to protect. That was worth everything. Grace turned from the window and looked at Katie, at Margaret's photograph on the mantel, at the flag folded in its case that had covered her father's coffin. She looked at the life she had built after combat, at the purpose she had found in teaching, at the legacy she was passing forward. And Grace Keller, soldier and teacher and keeper of promises, understood finally and completely that yes, it had been worth it. Every sacrifice, every loss, every moment of pain and fear and doubt, because the alternative was allowing darkness to win. And Grace had spent her entire life refusing to let darkness win. She walked back to the couch and sat beside Katie. They watched the fire die down together, mother and daughter, connected by love and legacy, and the understanding that some things were worth fighting for, even when the cost was high. Outside, the snow stopped falling. The world settled into the quiet of Christmas morning. And somewhere in a museum at Fort Bragg, a rifle rested in its case with an engraving that had become Grace's creed, her code, her way forward. Steady hand, clear eye, true heart. The mission was complete. The promises were kept. The legacy lived on. And Grace Keller, the ghost who had returned from the abyss, was finally, truly at peace. Years would pass. Grace would continue teaching until retirement finally claimed her for real at 55. She would train hundreds more soldiers, would write hundreds more letters, would carry the weight of service until her body would no longer let her do the work. Katie would graduate from MIT and become an engineer, would design systems that saved lives instead of taking them, would build a future that honored her mother's sacrifice without repeating it. Margaret would live to see her granddaughter graduate, would finally allow herself to believe that the cycle of military service had been broken, that Katie was free. And somewhere in the future, when Grace was old and gray and looking back on a life spent in service, she would think about her father in Hartley and all the soldiers who had gone before. She would think about the mountain and the cone and the moment when she had refused to die because she had promises to keep. She would think about Katie, free and happy, and building instead of destroying. And Grace would smile knowing that every sacrifice had meaning, that every promise kept mattered, that the long chain of soldiers stretching across generations had accomplished something worth the cost. Because in the end, that was all any soldier could hope for, to serve with honor, to keep their promises, to leave the world a little bit better than they found it. Grace Keller had done that. Against all odds, despite impossible circumstances, she had done exactly that. The ghost had come home. The promises were kept. The mission was complete. And the flag would continue to wave, long after Grace was gone, a symbol of everything 3 generations of Kellers had fought to protect. Steady hand, clear eye, true heart. The legacy lived on, forever,